There are nights when the desert whispers secrets that history never dared to write down. Tonight, you'll hear one of them. But before I tell you this story, I need to warn you about something. There's a document, sealed in the basement of the Cairo Museum. A document that historians discovered in 1947 but never fully published. A document that reveals something so disturbing about human nature that they decided the world wasn't ready for it. Tonight, I'm going to tell you what's in that document. I'm going to reveal the secret that Egyptologists have been keeping for 70 years. The truth about what really happened in the palace of Ramses III. And, more importantly, why it happened. Why a woman who had everything would risk everything. Why love can become the most dangerous force in the universe. Imagine this. You're standing in the middle of the Egyptian desert on a night when the moon isn't quite full. Hot wind blows past, carrying the scent of dry sand and frankincense from somewhere far away. In front of you, the pyramids stand silent, their shadows draped over them like sleeping gods. Beneath your feet, the sand is still warm from the day's sun. And in that wind, you hear something. Not just the voice of the past, but a question that will haunt you long after this night ends. The question is this: if you loved someone so much that you'd do anything for them, absolutely anything, would you still be capable of seeing the difference between saving them and destroying them? That's the question Queen T couldn't answer, and her failure to answer it correctly cost a king his life, cost her son his future, cost an entire civilization its innocence. Here's what I'm going to tell you tonight. I'm going to take you inside that palace, inside that conspiracy, inside the mind of a woman who convinced herself that murder was love. But more than that, I'm going to tell you something that even the official records don't say, something that only came out during the trial. Something so shocking that when the judges heard it, they had to take a 3-day recess just to process what it meant. I'm going to tell you that Ramses III knew. He knew about the conspiracy for months, maybe longer. He knew his wife was plotting to kill him, and he let it happen. He chose to trust when trust was clearly misplaced, chose to believe when belief was obviously foolish, chose love over self-preservation. And in doing so, he either became the most divine pharaoh who ever lived, or the most naive. I haven't decided which. And by the end of this night, you'll have to decide for yourself. If you're still listening, if that question grabbed you, if you want to know why a god king would let himself be murdered, then comment the number 1 right now. Let me know you're here with me, that you're ready for this journey, that you have the courage to hear a story that doesn't have easy answers or comfortable lessons. And if you want to take these journeys with me every night, if you want to explore the dark corners of history where the really interesting stories hide, then hit that subscribe button, because there are so many more secrets waiting, so many more questions that need asking, so many more truths that history tried to bury, but which refuse to stay dead. Now, take a deep breath. Relax your shoulders. Let your body sink into wherever you're lying or sitting. And prepare yourself, because we're going back 3,000 years. Back to a time when gods walked among men, when love and murder lived in the same palace, when a woman named Tiye made a choice that would echo through the centuries. A choice that will make you question everything you think you know about right and wrong, about love and possession, about sacrifice and selfishness. The story begins not with violence, but with a mother watching her son. And that's where all the best tragedies begin, in a moment of love that hasn't yet learned its own capacity for destruction. Are you ready? Then let's go. Let's step through time, through the veil between now and then, through the doorway that separates your world from theirs. And let's see what happens when love forgets to be wise, when ambition forgets to be moral, when a parent forgets that their child is not their possession, but their own person, with their own dreams, their own destiny, their own right to choose. This is the story of the conspiracy that nearly destroyed Egypt. But more than that, it's the story of how the best intentions can lead to the worst outcomes, how the purest love can become the deadliest poison, how being a mother can be both the most noble and the most dangerous thing a woman can be. The palace is waiting, the past is calling, and somewhere in the shadows, a woman is making a decision that will cost a king his throne, cost a son his soul, and cost you your sleep. Because once you hear this story, once you understand what it teaches about human nature, you'll never look at love the same way again. Let's begin. Chapter 1. The Golden Dream Inside the Palace. Step inside with me. You're standing before the palace gates of Ramses III, gates carved from Lebanon cedar and covered with gods whose eyes follow your every move. And the first thing you need to understand is this: everyone who enters these gates is trapped, not by walls, but by desire, not by chains, but by what they want, by what they think they deserve, by the gap between who they are and who they believe they should be. Queen T is trapped here, has been trapped for 20 years, and tonight you're going to watch her escape, but escape through the only door she can see. The door marked murder. The door she's convinced herself is actually marked love. Before we meet her, before we see the conspiracy, I need you to understand what it means to be a secondary wife in ancient, because this is where the poison starts. This is where the tragedy becomes inevitable. Imagine living in a palace with 300 women, all of them beautiful, all of them competing for one man's attention, all of them raising children who might be princes, or might be nothing, depending on which womb they came from, which bed their father visited on the night of their conception. Imagine knowing that your son, your beautiful, intelligent, strong son, will never wear the crown. Not because he's unworthy, but because you weren't the right woman. Because you weren't the great royal wife. Because in this game of thrones and wombs, you drew the wrong card from the beginning. And no amount of beauty or intelligence or loyalty can change that fundamental fact. Now, through these gates, into the garden where lotus flowers float on still water like dreams that will never be fulfilled. You see her there, sitting under a fig tree, Queen T. And the first thing you notice isn't her beauty, though she is beautiful in that particular way of women who've learned to weaponize their appearance, who know that beauty is power, but power isn't enough. The first thing you notice is her eyes, specifically where they're looking, specifically the intensity with which they're watching something across the garden, in the training yard, where a young man is practicing with a sword. That's Pentaweret, her son. And if you could measure the force of a mother's gaze, if you could quantify the weight of love mixed with ambition, mixed with desperation, mixed with the absolute conviction that the universe has made a terrible mistake, you'd understand why what's about to happen feels not just possible, but inevitable. Watch how he moves. Watch Pentaweret cut through his opponents like they're made of papyrus instead of flesh and training. Watch him disarm one, defeat two, stand victorious while the swordmaster applauds and says words that land like dagger thrusts in T's heart. You were born to be king. You have everything a pharaoh needs, everything except the right to claim it. Those words, meant as compliment, received as curse, as confirmation of everything T has felt for years, that her son is being cheated, that fate is unfair, that something must be done, that someone must act, that if the gods won't correct their mistake, then she will, she must, she has no choice. Or at least, that's what she's telling herself. That's the story she's constructing, that's the narrative that will justify what comes next. And here's your first question, the first of many you'll face tonight. When does love for your child become something else? When does wanting the best for them transform into wanting what you want for them? When does being a mother shift from selfless to selfish? And how do we know? How can we possibly know when we've crossed that line? She stands up now, walks not toward her son, but away from him, toward a door at the edge of the garden, and you follow because that's your role in this story. Witness, observer, the soul from the future watching the past unfold, powerless to intervene, able only to understand, to learn, to carry these lessons forward into your own time, your own choices, your own moments when you'll have to decide between controlling and releasing, between protecting and smothering, between love that liberates and love that imprisons. Through the door, down a corridor where the walls are painted with scenes of domestic harmony that mock the reality unfolding within them, to a private chamber where she keeps her secrets, where she does her thinking, where for the past 6 months she's been having conversations with herself. Conversations that have slowly, incrementally, almost imperceptibly transformed from "how can I help my son" to "what would I be willing to do for my son" to "is there anything I wouldn't do for my son?" And finally, inevitably, terrifyingly, to "who would I be willing to kill for my son?" But here's what you don't know yet. Here's what I'm going to tell you that changes everything. She's not the first secondary wife to think these thoughts. Not the first mother to feel this pain. Not the first woman to stand at this crossroads where love meets murder. 3 times before, in the history of Egypt, secondary wives have plotted against pharaohs. And all 3 times they were discovered before they could act. Arrested, executed, their names erased from history, turned into cautionary tales told to frighten ambitious women into submission. Queen T knows these stories, has studied them, has learned from their failures. And this is what makes her dangerous. Not her passion, but her patience. Not her anger, but her intelligence. Not her desperation, but her absolute certainty that she's figured out what they got wrong, that she won't make their mistakes, that her conspiracy will succeed where theirs failed. She moves to a small chest in the corner of her chamber, opens it, removes a piece of papyrus covered in her own handwriting, a list. Names in one column, weaknesses in another, potential leverage in a third. This is how conspiracies begin. Not with dramatic declarations or revolutionary manifestos, but with lists, with careful observation, with the patient accumulation of information about who wants what, who fears what, who can be bought, and who can be manipulated, and who can be convinced that what you want is actually what they want. is actually what Egypt needs, is actually what the gods themselves would command, if only they could speak directly. At the top of the list, one name circled 3 times: Pebekamen, the steward. The man who's served this palace for 23 years. The man who knows every secret, every passage, every weakness in the palace security. And most importantly, the man who has 2 sons of his own. 2 sons who aren't going anywhere. 2 sons whose futures depend entirely on the goodwill of whoever sits on the throne. 2 sons who could benefit greatly if the right prince became Pharaoh. And here's the first lesson, the first piece of wisdom this story offers. The thing Queen T understands but refuses to acknowledge. When we start making lists of people we can manipulate, when we start calculating who can be used for what purpose, when we start seeing human beings as tools rather than as souls, we've already lost something essential. We've already crossed a line that can't be uncrossed. We've already become something we never intended to become. But she doesn't see this, can't see this, won't see this. Because she's convinced herself that her love for her son justifies anything, excuses everything, makes her not a manipulator, but a mother, not a schemer, but a protector, not a future murderer, but a woman doing what must be done. You watch her study this list, watch her lips move as she plans her first conversation with Pebekamen. Watch her rehearse her words, her tone, her gestures, everything calculated to make him feel like he's making his own choice, when really he's just following a script she's written, walking a path she's laid out, becoming exactly what she needs him to be. And you want to reach out, want to shake her, want to say, "Stop, this is where it starts. This is the moment you can still turn back. After this, there's no returning. After this, you'll be someone different, someone you can't ever unbecome." But you can't. You're just a witness, just a soul passing through, just someone who already knows how this ends and can only watch it begin, again and again, in every generation, in every palace, in every heart where love becomes twisted, where good intentions pave the road to hell, where a mother's fierce protection becomes a child's destruction. The sun is setting now, painting the chamber in shades of amber and shadow. And Queen T is satisfied with her plan, satisfied with her preparations, satisfied that what she's about to do is necessary, is justified, is the only way to correct the cosmic injustice of her son's exclusion from power. She doesn't look like a villain, doesn't feel like a murderer, doesn't think of herself as anything other than a loving mother doing what loving mothers do. Protecting their children, securing their futures, fighting against a world that treats them unfairly. And that's the real horror of this story. Not that she's evil, but that she's convinced she's good. Not that she wants to destroy, but that she believes she's saving. Not that she's about to commit the worst crime imaginable, but that she thinks she's about to perform the highest act of love. If you can feel it, if you can sense the tragedy forming, if you recognize in Queen T something you've seen in yourself or someone you know, that moment when good intentions start turning dark, comment "yes" right now. Let me know you're feeling this with me, that you understand we're not watching a monster, but watching a human being become monstrous. And there's a difference, a crucial difference that we need to understand if we're going to avoid becoming her. Tomorrow, she'll begin recruiting her conspirators. Tomorrow, the machinery of murder will start turning. Tomorrow, the distance between thought and action will begin to close. But tonight, in this moment, she's still just a woman sitting in her chamber, holding a list, believing she's doing the right thing. And that belief, that absolute certainty in her own righteousness, that's what makes everything that follows possible. The golden dream is about to become a blood-soaked nightmare. But she can't see that, can't imagine that, can't conceive that her love could lead anywhere except to triumph, to vindication, to her son finally receiving what he deserves, what she deserves, what they both deserve after years of being overlooked, undervalued, treated as secondary when they should have been primary, should have been first, should have been everything. The first chapter closes with a mother loving her son, and that's the most dangerous beginning of all. Chapter 2. The poison seed is planted. 3 days later, when the afternoon heat makes the air shimmer like water, and most sensible people are resting in shade, Queen T sits in her private garden watching her son practice. And you need to understand something about this moment, about this watching, about this particular quality of attention she's paying. This isn't the gentle observation of a proud mother. This is something else. This is assessment, calculation, the kind of looking that measures and judges and finds the world wanting. She's building her case, gathering evidence for a trial that exists only in her mind, a trial where the universe stands accused of injustice, and she's appointed herself judge, jury, and executioner. Every perfect strike Pentaweret makes with his sword, every victory over his training partners, every moment of excellence becomes another piece of evidence, another proof that she's right, that her son deserves more, that action is required, that she's not plotting murder, but correcting a cosmic error. But here's what she's not seeing. Here's what love makes invisible when it becomes obsession. Pentaweret is happy. Watch his face as he fights. Watch him laugh when he's defeated. Watch him help his fallen opponents up. Watch him bow respectfully to his teacher. Watch him exist in this moment without reaching for anything beyond it, without wanting anything more than this: the simple joy of physical excellence, the camaraderie of training, the satisfaction of improvement. He doesn't need to be Pharaoh to be complete, doesn't need a crown to be worthy, doesn't need his mother's conspiracy to be fulfilled. But she can't see this, or won't see this, or has decided not to see this. Because if she saw it, if she truly understood that her son is content, then her entire justification crumbles. Her whole narrative collapses, and she'd have to face the terrifying possibility that this isn't about him at all, that it's about her ego, her pain, her need to matter, to control, to reshape reality according to her vision of how things should be. And here's something you need to know, something I learned from the trial documents that were sealed for centuries. Queen T had another son, a son who died young, before Pentaweret was born, a son who was firstborn, a son who should have been heir, a son who died from fever when he was just 5 years old, and she never recovered from that loss, never forgave herself for failing to save him, never stopped wondering what he would have become if he'd lived. Every time she looks at Pentaweret, she's seeing both sons, seeing the dead one and the living one, seeing what was lost and what could still be saved. And that doubling, that projection, that inability to separate past grief from present love, that's part of what's driving her. That's part of what makes this conspiracy not just about ambition, but about redemption, about proving to herself that she can protect this son where she failed the first, can secure this son's future where the first son had none, can be the mother she couldn't be before. She stands up, walks toward the palace, and you follow her through corridors that are simultaneously beautiful and oppressive, golden and constricting, palatial and prison-like. She's heading toward Pebekamen's quarters, toward the first actual step in her conspiracy, toward the moment when thoughts become words, and words become commitments, and commitments become crimes. You can feel the weight of this moment, the significance of what's about to happen, because once she speaks her plan out loud, once she brings another person into her circle of intention, it becomes real in a way it wasn't before. It becomes harder to deny, harder to stop, harder to pretend it's just a fantasy she's entertaining, rather than a plot she's executing. Pebekamen is in his small office when she enters, a room that smells of papyrus and ink, and the particular must of stored records. And he immediately stands, bows, shows the deference due to a queen. But there's something else in his posture, something in his eyes, a kind of wary intelligence that suggests he's already sensed something is coming, that he's been watching her watch him, that he understands in some instinctive way that she's selected him for something, and he's both honored and afraid in equal measure. "My queen," he says, his voice betraying nothing. "How may I serve you?" And she begins, carefully, indirectly, asking questions about his sons, about their futures, about his concerns for their prospects, establishing empathy first, creating connection, making him feel seen and understood, before she moves to the actual ask. And this is how corruption works. This is how good people become accomplices to evil. Not through dramatic seduction, but through gradual intimacy, through the slow building of obligation and shared complaint, and the sense that maybe, just maybe, the rules that govern everyone else don't have to apply to us, because our situation is special, our cause is just, our motives are pure. The conversation lasts 30 minutes, but the crucial moment comes at minute 23, when she says, almost casually, almost as if the thought just occurred to her, "Wouldn't it be better for Egypt if the most capable prince became Pharaoh rather than the one born to the right mother? Wouldn't the gods prefer merit over accident? Wouldn't a wise steward who truly loves this kingdom support such an outcome, even if it required—" She pauses here, letting him fill in the blank. "Even if it required extraordinary measures." And Pebekamen, this man who's served faithfully for 23 years, this man who prides himself on his loyalty and integrity, this man who never imagined he'd become a conspirator, feels something shift inside him, feels a door opening that he'd always assumed was locked. And he doesn't run away, doesn't protest, doesn't end the conversation and report her to authorities. Instead, he says, very quietly, "What kind of extraordinary measures, my queen?" And with those 6 words, he's in. He's committed. He's become part of something that will end with blood on his hands, and his neck broken by a pharaoh's dying grip. Here's your second lesson. Here's what this moment teaches us about how ordinary people become criminals. It's not through grand declarations or obvious evil. It's through small compromises, through agreeing to listen to what shouldn't be said, through failing to stop something when stopping is still possible, through the tiny, incremental steps that each seem reasonable in isolation, but which accumulate into catastrophe. Pebekamen doesn't think of himself as agreeing to murder. He thinks of himself as having a conversation. Just a conversation. Just a theoretical discussion. Just an acknowledgement that yes, maybe things aren't quite fair. Maybe the system is flawed. Maybe someone should do something. And by the time he realizes he's not discussing murder, but planning it, he's already too deep to climb back out, already too invested to turn back, already too frightened of the consequences of betrayal to consider the consequences of completion. Over the next weeks, the conspiracy grows like mold in darkness, spreading through the palace, infecting one person, then another, then another. Each recruitment following the same pattern. The careful approach, the building of trust, the gradual revelation of the plan, the mixture of incentive and threat that makes people feel they're choosing to participate, when really they're just choosing between bad options and worse ones. Queen T proves to be a masterful recruiter, understanding instinctively which people can be bought with money, which with promises of position, which with appeals to their own sense of grievance and injustice, which with fear of what will happen if they refuse. She builds a network of about 20 people, some who know the full scope of the plot, others who think they're just helping with minor irregularities, creating plausible deniability for herself and her key collaborators, constructing the conspiracy in layers so that if one layer is discovered, the others remain hidden, remain protected, remain capable of continuing the plan. But here's what none of them know. Here's the secret I promised to tell you that changes everything about how we understand this story. There's an informant in the conspiracy, someone who's reporting everything to the Pharaoh's intelligence network, someone who's been feeding information about Queen T's activities for months. And Ramses knows. He knows about the meetings, knows about the recruitment, knows about the plan. And he's letting it continue, letting it develop, letting it get close to execution. And nobody can quite understand why. Nobody can figure out what he's waiting for, what he's thinking, what his end game is. Is he testing them, giving them rope to hang themselves? Or is he testing himself, seeing if he can trust where trust seems impossible, believing in redemption where redemption seems unlikely? We'll find out, but not yet. Not for several more chapters. For now, just know that this conspiracy that seems so secret, so careful, so protected, is actually being observed, being documented, being allowed to proceed for reasons that even the observers don't fully understand. The seed is planted now, planted in fertile soil, watered by grievance and ambition, growing in the darkness of secret meetings and whispered plans. And Queen T watches it grow, with satisfaction, with pride, with the absolute conviction that she's doing something noble, something necessary, something that history will eventually justify and vindicate and celebrate as the action of a mother who loved her son enough to reshape the world for him. She doesn't see the poison in the seed, doesn't smell the rot in the roots, doesn't sense that what she's growing isn't a garden, but a graveyard, isn't producing life, but preparing death, isn't creating a future, but destroying one. And that blindness, that ability to look directly at evil and see love, to stare at murder and see sacrifice, to confuse destruction with protection, that's what makes her not just dangerous, but tragic. Not just a villain, but a cautionary tale. Not just someone to condemn, but someone to understand. Because if we can understand how she got here, how love became twisted, how good intentions became corrupted, maybe we can catch ourselves before we make the same journey, before we plant the same seeds, before we cultivate the same poison. If you're thinking about your own life right now, if you're wondering whether you've ever planted seeds like this, whether you've ever justified something questionable by telling yourself it was for a good cause, for someone you love, for a purpose higher than mere morality, comment continue, and let me know you're brave enough to keep examining this, to keep looking at the uncomfortable truths, to keep learning from Queen T's mistakes, even as we watch her make them. The poison seed is planted, and now we wait for it to grow, to break through the soil, to flower into betrayal and blood and all the terrible consequences that follow. When love forgets, it's supposed to be wise. When protection becomes possession. When a mother's fierce devotion becomes her child's greatest danger. 3 more months until the festival of Opet. 3 more months until the conspiracy reaches its culmination. 3 more months for Queen T to feel satisfied with her plans, proud of her cleverness, certain of her righteousness, completely unaware that everything she thinks she's hidden is actually known. Everything she thinks she's controlling is actually being observed. Everything she thinks she's creating is actually destroying. Not just her enemies, but herself, her son, and everyone she claims to love. Chapter 3. The Network of Shadows. 6 months into the conspiracy, something has changed in the palace. Something you can feel, even if you can't quite name it. Like the air pressure before a storm, like the silence before an earthquake, like that moment when predator and prey both sense the hunt is about to begin, but neither knows yet which role they're playing. You're walking through the palace now in the deep hours before dawn, following Queen T as she makes her way to a forgotten storage room in the oldest part of the harem complex. A room so covered in dust that no one remembers what it was originally used for. A room perfect for meetings that can't be discovered, for conversations that can't be overheard, for the kind of planning that requires absolute darkness to flourish. But here's what you need to understand before we enter that room, before we witness this meeting. The conspiracy has reached a critical mass, has grown beyond Queen T's ability to fully control it, has developed its own momentum, its own logic, its own appetite for conclusion. There are now 23 people involved at various levels, 23 people who know pieces of the plan. And each of these people is a potential crack in the foundation, a potential point of failure, a potential betrayer, either to conscience or to self-interest. Queen T doesn't understand this yet, doesn't see that conspiracies are like avalanches. Once they start moving, they can't be stopped or redirected. They can only be ridden to whatever conclusion momentum dictates. And that conclusion is rarely the one the initiator intended. The room is lit by a single oil lamp when you enter, its flame creating more shadow than light. And gathered around that small circle of illumination are the key conspirators, the core group, who know the full scope of what's being planned. You recognize Pebekamen, looking older than he did 6 months ago. The weight of what he's agreed to do, aging him faster than time alone could manage. Beside him is Mesahure, another steward, younger, more nervous, hands constantly moving, fingers drumming against his thigh in a rhythm that matches his anxious heartbeat. 3 palace guards stand together, men who should be protecting the Pharaoh, but who've been convinced through a combination of gold and grievance that their loyalty lies elsewhere. 2 women from the harem hover at the edge of the light, minor wives whose own sons have no chance of succession, who've been recruited through appeals to their maternal frustration, their sense of cosmic injustice, their belief that maybe if the system is broken for everyone, then breaking it further might create opportunity for their children. Queen T enters last, and the energy in the room shifts, everyone straightening, focusing, becoming more alert, like soldiers when their commander arrives, like actors when the director enters rehearsal, like conspirators when the person they're conspiring for finally appears. She's dressed simply tonight. Dark robes, no jewelry, hair covered, trying to blend into shadows. But there's no hiding her authority, no disguising the fact that she's the sun around which all these planets orbit, the center of gravity that holds this conspiracy together. And without her will and vision and absolute conviction, these people would scatter, would return to their normal lives, would never have found each other or this terrible purpose. My friends, she begins, and notice how she calls them friends, not servants, not subjects, not conspirators, but friends. Creating intimacy, creating equality, creating the sense that they're all in this together, all equals in a noble cause, even though that's a lie, even though she's using them, even though if this fails, she'll sacrifice every one of them to save herself. We've been meeting in secret for 6 months now, building trust, building our network, building our courage. And the time has come to speak plainly about what we've been circling around, what we've been avoiding saying directly, what we all know but haven't yet named. She pauses, letting the tension build, letting them lean forward, letting them ready themselves for what's coming. What we are planning is not merely palace intrigue, not merely rearranging positions or redirecting favor. We are planning to change the future of Egypt itself, to ensure that the right person, the most capable person, the person chosen by merit rather than accident of birth, sits on the throne of the two lands. And that person is my son, Pentaweret. The words hang in the air like smoke, and you can see the reactions rippling through the gathered conspirators, some nodding as if this confirms what they already suspected, others looking shocked as if hearing it stated so directly makes it suddenly more real, more dangerous, more irrevocable. But the crucial word, the one Queen T hasn't said yet, the one they're all waiting to hear, is how. How will this transformation happen? How will Pentaweret become Pharaoh when Ramses still lives and the legitimate heir still breathes? How does one change the succession without, and here's where the silence becomes unbearable, without removing the obstacles that stand in the way? Tebekamen clears his throat, steps forward slightly, becomes the voice for what everyone is thinking but no one wants to say. My queen, he begins carefully, measuring each word. We are all committed to Prince Pentaweret's cause. We all believe he deserves to rule. But the path from here to there requires us to... He pauses, searching for euphemism, searching for language that makes the unspeakable sound reasonable, to remove the current obstacle to his rightful succession. There it is. The word remove. Doing the work that murder should do. Making assassination sound like housekeeping. Making regicide sound like solving a problem. Making the killing of a god king sound like simple logistics. And this is how evil talks. This is the language of atrocity. This careful avoidance of naming what's actually being planned. This retreat into abstractions and euphemisms, and words that mean terrible things while sounding benign. Here's your lesson for this chapter. Here's what you need to understand about how normal people convince themselves to do terrible things. They never call it by its real name. They never look directly at what they're doing. They construct elaborate verbal architectures that allow them to discuss murder without saying murder, to plan evil while telling themselves they're doing good, to become monsters while maintaining their self-image as moral people. If Tebekamen had said, "We need to kill the Pharaoh," if he'd used those words exactly, he might have hurt himself, might have recognized what he was becoming, might have had the chance to stop. But by saying, "Remove the obstacle," by using that careful language, he can continue believing he's just solving a problem, just doing what's necessary, just being practical about achieving a goal everyone agrees is worthwhile. Queen T nods, appreciates the careful phrasing, understands that this is how the conspiracy must proceed. Through careful language, through euphemism, through never quite saying what they actually mean, while everyone understands exactly what they're planning. Yes, she says, her voice firm, devoid of doubt. That is exactly what I mean. The current Pharaoh, great though he has been, is the obstacle between my son and his rightful destiny. And obstacles, no matter how beloved, must be removed. She lets that sink in, watches their faces, measures who's ready and who's wavering, who has the stomach for what's coming, and who might break when theory becomes practice. The plan that emerges from this meeting is detailed, sophisticated, years of careful observation compressed into a blueprint for murder. They'll strike during the festival of Opet, when the palace is crowded with visitors, when security is paradoxically relaxed because everyone assumes strength in numbers means safety, when the chaos of celebration provides perfect cover for conspiracy. The guards will ensure certain posts are vacant at crucial moments, will respond to manufactured emergencies that pull them away from the Pharaoh's chambers, will look the other way when they should be looking directly at crime. The women will unlock doors that should be locked, will ensure that certain servants are assigned to certain tasks, will create the conditions that make murder possible. Mesahure will add sedatives to the Pharaoh's evening wine. Nothing obvious, nothing that would alert tasters, just enough to slow reactions, to make a man normally alert and powerful just slightly less so. Just vulnerable enough that 6 armed men might succeed where 600 couldn't otherwise. And Pebekamen, loyal Pebekamen who served Ramses for 23 years, who ate the Pharaoh's bread and drank his wine and swore sacred oaths of protection. Pebekamen will lead the strike team, will be the one to actually raise the dagger, will become the primary murderer in a crime that will echo through 3,000 years. But here's what none of them know. What I'm going to tell you now that changes everything. There's someone else in the palace watching this conspiracy develop. Not the informant I mentioned before, someone else. Someone closer. Someone who has access to Queen T's private papers, who's been reading her plans, who knows details that even the conspirators themselves don't know. And that person is Prince Pentaweret himself. Not intentionally, not because he's spying, but because he came looking for his mother one afternoon and found her chamber door unlocked and papers left on her desk. And curiosity did what curiosity does. Made him look where he shouldn't. Made him read what wasn't meant for his eyes. Made him discover that his mother is planning to murder his father to make him Pharaoh. And for the past 3 weeks, he's been carrying this knowledge like a stone in his stomach, not knowing what to do with it, not able to believe it's real, hoping desperately that he's misunderstood, that there's some other explanation, that his mother couldn't possibly be planning what those papers clearly indicate she's planning. This is the tragedy within the tragedy, the knife inside the wound, the poison in the supposed cure, that the person this conspiracy is meant to benefit is the one person who would never agree to it if asked, who loves his father too much to want the throne at the cost of patricide, who would rather remain a secondary prince forever than become Pharaoh through murder. But Queen T never asked him, never consulted him, never considered that maybe her vision of what her son needs isn't what her son actually wants. And this failure of imagination, this inability to see her child as separate from herself, as having his own desires and moral boundaries and agency, this is what transforms her love into destruction, her protection into poison, her maternal devotion into his future torment. The meeting breaks up slowly, people leaving in ones and twos through different exits, returning to their normal lives while carrying this terrible secret. This burden that grows heavier with each day that passes. This knowledge that weighs on conscience and makes sleep difficult, and turns ordinary conversations into minefields, where one wrong word could expose everything. Queen T is the last to leave, standing alone in the darkness after the lamp is extinguished. And in that darkness, you can feel her satisfaction, her sense of accomplishment, her belief that everything is proceeding perfectly, that her plan is sound, that her son will soon have what he deserves, completely unaware that her son knows, that her son is horrified, that her son is trying desperately to figure out how to stop this without destroying his mother, how to save his father without condemning the woman who gave him life, how to be honorable in a situation where honor seems to require betraying someone he loves, no matter what choice he makes. If your heart is breaking right now for Pentaweret, if you understand the impossible position he's in, if you've ever been trapped between two people you love who are destroying each other, comment calm and let me know you feel this. That you understand we're watching not just one tragedy, but multiple tragedies interweaving, each person suffering in their own way, each person trapped in their own hell, each person convinced they're doing the right thing, while actually contributing to catastrophe. The network of shadows is complete now, woven tight, every thread connected, every person positioned, every element of the plan locked in place. And all that remains is waiting for the festival of Opet, waiting for the moment when thought becomes action, when plan becomes execution, when conspiracy becomes murder. But conspiracies are like living things. They have their own will, their own direction, their own tendency toward chaos. And this one is about to prove that no matter how carefully you plan, no matter how thoroughly you prepare, no matter how certain you are of success, there are always factors you can't control, always variables you haven't considered, always the possibility that what you think is your greatest triumph will actually be your ultimate destruction. 3 more months until the festival. 3 more months for Queen T to feel confident, for the conspirators to feel ready, for Pentaweret to wrestle with his conscience, for the informant to keep reporting, for Ramses to keep watching, for fate to sharpen its blade and prepare to cut through everyone's careful plans, leaving nothing but blood and regret, and the eternal question of how love became murder, how protection became destruction, how the best intentions led to the worst outcome imaginable. Chapter 4. The Festival of Opet, Night of Destiny. The Festival of Opet arrives like a beautiful catastrophe, sweeping through Thebes with color and sound, and the kind of collective ecstasy that makes people forget who they are, forget their responsibilities, forget that beneath the surface of celebration, beneath the drums and flutes and chanting crowds, something dark is preparing to be born. You're standing now at the edge of the great processional way, and the first thing you need to understand about this festival, about this moment, is that it's not just religious celebration, it's a thinning of boundaries, a breaking down of walls between sacred and profane, divine and human, acceptable and forbidden. And in that space of thinned boundaries, in that moment when normal rules seem suspended, terrible things become possible, unthinkable acts become thinkable, and conspirators find the courage to do what sober reflection would never allow. The crowds are immense, thousands upon thousands pressing close together, their voices rising in songs that have been sung for 1,000 years, songs of renewal and regeneration, songs about gods visiting gods, about divine marriages, about the eternal return of fertility and blessing. Songs that, ironically, celebrate life, while murder waits in the wings like an uninvited guest at a wedding. The sacred bark is passing now, carried on the shoulders of priests, a massive gilded boat holding the hidden image of Amun, and the crowd surges forward, desperately trying to get close, trying to receive blessing, trying to touch even the shadow of the god as it passes. And in this surge, in this chaos of devotion, you can feel how easy it would be for conspirators to move unseen, to position themselves, to execute a plan, while everyone else is looking elsewhere, focused on the divine rather than the human, on the spectacle rather than the crime. But here's what you need to know about this particular festival of Opet, about this specific day in Egyptian history. It's not just conspirators who are using the festival as cover. It's also the Pharaoh's intelligence service, who have positioned their own people throughout the crowds, who are watching the watchers, who have been tracking every conspirator for months, documenting their movements, recording their communications, building a case that will be used later, after the attempt, after the conspiracy reveals itself fully. Because, you see, Ramses has decided not to prevent the assassination attempt, but to let it proceed as far as it can go short of success. To let Queen T and her accomplices reveal themselves completely, irrevocably, in ways that leave no possibility of denial or alternative explanation. And this decision, this choice to risk his own life to expose betrayal fully, this is either the most brilliant tactical move or the most dangerous gamble in Egyptian history. And even those implementing the plan aren't sure which it is. From her balcony high in the palace, Queen T watches the festival unfold below, watches the crowds, the celebration, the chaos that provides perfect cover for murder. And her satisfaction is almost palpable. Her sense that everything is aligning, everything is perfect, everything is proceeding exactly as planned. She's wearing her finest linen today, her most elaborate jewelry, playing the role of devoted royal wife, attending the festival with appropriate piety. But inside she's counting hours until nightfall, counting guards and conspirators, counting the minutes until her son becomes Pharaoh, and she becomes the mother of Pharaoh. Vindicated, triumphant, proved right about everything she believed. And if there's any doubt left in her heart, any last whisper of conscience suggesting that maybe this isn't necessary, maybe there's another way, maybe murder is always wrong, regardless of motive, she's silenced it so thoroughly that she doesn't even hear it anymore, doesn't even recognize it as something that once existed in her soul. Down in the streets, moving through the crowds with purposeful randomness, Pentaweret is searching for someone, anyone, who can help him stop what he knows is coming tonight. He's tried to approach his father directly 3 times in the past weeks, but each time something has prevented it. Guards appearing at wrong moments, meetings running long, doors that should be open being inexplicably locked. And he's beginning to suspect that his mother has somehow divined his knowledge, has positioned people to keep him away from the Pharaoh, has closed off every avenue he might use to warn the intended victim. His desperation is growing with each passing hour, his sense that time is running out, that tonight his father will die, and he'll have failed to prevent it, and he'll spend the rest of his life knowing that he had knowledge that could have saved a life, and couldn't find a way to use it. couldn't find the courage or cleverness or resources to make a difference when difference mattered most. And here's your lesson. Here's what Pentaweret's struggle teaches us about the difference between knowing and acting, between awareness and effectiveness, between good intentions and actual outcomes. It's not enough to know the right thing, not enough to want to do the right thing. We have to find ways to translate knowledge into action, awareness into intervention, good intentions into concrete steps that change reality. And that translation is often harder than we imagine, blocked by obstacles we didn't anticipate, complicated by factors we didn't consider, requiring resources or courage or opportunities we don't possess. And this is why passive goodness isn't enough. Why being right, but ineffective, is still a kind of failure. Why the person who knows about evil and does nothing is complicit, even if their heart is pure, even if their intentions are noble, even if they tried and failed, because trying and failing still leaves evil triumphant and innocence destroyed. As sunset approaches, as the celebration reaches its peak intensity, as drums beat faster and voices rise higher and dancers spin themselves into trance states, the conspirators begin their final positioning. Pevekamen and his strike team gather in a servants' corridor near the royal quarters, wearing dark clothes, carrying weapons hidden under robes, drinking wine mixed with stimulants to give them courage, to quiet the voice of conscience that's screaming at all of them to stop, to override their natural reluctance to murder someone they've served, someone who's never harmed them, someone who in fact has been generous and kind and everything a pharaoh should be. They're psyching themselves up, telling each other stories that justify what they're about to do, reminding themselves of grievances, real and imagined, convincing themselves that they're not murderers, but patriots, not criminals, but revolutionaries, not betrayers, but saviors. And if you listen closely, you can hear in their voices the desperation of people who know they're lying to themselves, but can't afford to stop, who understand on some level that they're crossing a line they'll never be able to uncross, but who've invested too much, gone too far, committed too deeply to turn back now. The manufactured emergency happens right on schedule. Smoke and shouting from the eastern wing, guards rushing to respond to what they think is a real fire, leaving the approach to the pharaoh's chambers temporarily unguarded. A 10-minute window of opportunity that the conspirators have been planning for months to exploit. They move quickly now. No more time for hesitation. No more room for doubt. They're committed. They're doing this. God help them, they're actually doing this. And each step they take toward the royal chambers is a step away from who they used to be. A step toward who they'll become. A step into a future they can't yet imagine, but which will haunt every one of them for whatever time they have left to live. Ramses III sits at his writing desk in his private chambers, working on correspondence by lamplight. And here's what you need to understand about this moment, about his apparent vulnerability, about his decision to be alone with minimal guard during the festival. He's not being careless. He's being intentional. He's positioned himself exactly where the conspirators expect him to be, exactly as vulnerable as they need him to be to proceed with confidence. And hidden in the shadows, in places the conspirators don't know about, are the pharaoh's personal guard, the truly loyal ones, the ones who've been briefed on what's coming, who are ready to intervene, but only after the attempt is made, only after the conspiracy reveals itself fully, only after there's no possibility of claiming it was all a misunderstanding or a theoretical discussion that never meant to proceed to action. But here's what nobody planned for. Here's the variable that will change everything. One of the hidden guards, a young soldier named Amenhotep, doesn't understand the full plan, doesn't know that he's supposed to wait, doesn't realize that the Pharaoh wants the conspirators to actually enter the chamber, to actually raise their weapons, to actually reveal themselves completely before intervention occurs. And when he sees the conspirators approaching, when he sees Bedtime and his team moving toward the royal chambers with weapons drawn, young Amenhotep makes a decision that seems obvious to him, seems like the only right choice. He jumps out of his hiding place to sound the alarm, to warn the Pharaoh, to do what guards are supposed to do, which is prevent threats rather than allowing them to develop. And in doing so, in acting from pure motive and clear conscience, he accidentally triggers the catastrophe that everyone has been trying to either create or prevent. He forces the conspirators to improvise, to move faster than planned, to enter the chambers with less preparation and more panic. And he alerts Ramses that the moment is here. The test is beginning. The gamble he's been planning is now in play, but without the careful control he'd hoped to maintain. The door to the royal chambers bursts open, not quietly as planned, but violently. Conspirators rushing in with weapons raised, no more pretense, no more careful approach. Just desperate men knowing they've been discovered and having to choose between abandoning their plan or committing to it fully. Having to decide in seconds whether to become murderers or to beg for mercy, whether to finish what they started or to throw themselves on the Pharaoh's mercy and hope for forgiveness. And Ramses stands up from his desk, turning to face them. And in that moment, in that eternal second when predator and prey face each other, when murderer and victim share space and breath, and the terrible intimacy of violence about to occur, something passes between the Pharaoh and his would-be assassins. Something that transcends words. Something like understanding, like sadness, like the recognition that they're all trapped in roles they can't escape, playing out a script that was written long before any of them were born. And that script has only one possible ending, only one way this scene can conclude. And everyone in the room knows it, feels it, understands that what's about to happen is simultaneously tragedy and inevitability, crime and fate, murder and something that feels almost like sacrifice. Stay with me now, because what happens next is the secret I promised you, the revelation that changes everything about how we understand this story. And if you have the courage to hear it, if you're ready for the truth that historians tried to hide, then keep listening. Because we're about to step into the moment that defines not just this conspiracy, but the entire question of what it means to trust, to love, to believe in humanity, even when humanity is preparing to betray you. Chapter 5. The Pharaoh's Last Blood. Even a god-king cannot survive when 6 men are determined to see him dead. That's what history will tell you. That's the simple, brutal truth of it. But what history won't tell you, what the official records will never say, is that in those final moments, as Ramses III's life bled out onto the limestone floor that had been polished to mirror brightness just that morning, something passed between the dying pharaoh and his murderers. Something that none of them expected. Something that would haunt every single one of them until their own deaths. You're there in the room, standing in the corner where shadows are deepest, watching as the violence finally stops. As the conspirators step back from what they've done, panting, clothes torn and blood-stained, staring down at the man who ruled Egypt for over 3 decades. The man who defeated the Sea Peoples, who built Abu Simbel, who expanded Egyptian influence to its greatest extent in generations, now lying broken on his own bedroom floor. Bedtime lies beside him, neck snapped by the pharaoh's final act of vengeance, The loyal servant who became a traitor, now paying the ultimate price for his betrayal. The other 5 conspirators stand frozen, the magnitude of their crime beginning to sink in. The reality of what they've just done hitting them like a physical force. One of them, a young guard named Prehirwenemef, begins to sob uncontrollably. "We have killed the son of Ra," he whispers. "The gods will destroy us all. They will curse our families for 1,000 generations." But there's no time for remorse. Already they can hear voices in the corridors outside, servants calling for the Pharaoh, guards returning from the manufactured emergency in the eastern wing. The conspirators have perhaps minutes before their crime is discovered, and their survival depends on executing the rest of their plan with perfect precision. They need to leave, need to get out, need to disappear back into the festival crowds before anyone knows what happened here. But as they turn to go, as they move toward the door, something stops them, all of them at the same instant, some instinct making them look back one more time at the man they've murdered. And that's when they see it, when you see it, the thing that wasn't supposed to happen, the detail that will change everything. Ramses III is not quite dead yet. His chest is still rising and falling, shallow, rapid breaths, blood bubbling from his mouth as he tries to speak. The conspirators freeze, horrified. They thought it was over, thought he was gone, but he's still here, still conscious, still trying to say something. Against every instinct for self-preservation, one of them, a palace worker named Hori, steps closer, kneels beside the dying pharaoh, leans in to hear what he's trying to say. The pharaoh's lips move, blood-flecked words coming out barely audible, and Hori's face goes pale, goes gray, goes completely still as he listens. Then he stands up quickly, backs away, shaking his head. "No, no, no," he whispers. "That's not possible. That cannot be true." The others crowd around him, demanding to know what the pharaoh said. But Hori won't tell them, can't tell them, just keeps shaking his head and backing toward the door. They don't have time for this. They need to leave now. So they grab Hori and drag him with them, fleeing the royal chambers, leaving 2 bodies behind, one dead and one dying, leaving the scene of their crime, just seconds before the first servants arrive to discover what has happened. But here's what you need to know. Here's the secret I promised to tell you. The thing that changes everything about this story. The truth that history buried because it was too terrible, too paradoxical, too impossible to reconcile with the official narrative. Ramses III knew. Not just in those final moments, not just when the conspirators burst into his room with daggers drawn, but for months, perhaps longer. He knew about the conspiracy, knew that his wife Tiye was plotting against him, knew that trusted servants were being corrupted, knew that a movement was growing to replace him with his own son. How did he know, you might ask? How could he know and do nothing to stop it? The answer is both simple and heartbreaking. He knew because he was Pharaoh, because the palace has eyes and ears everywhere, because you don't rule Egypt for 3 decades without developing an intelligence network that tells you everything happening in your kingdom, including, and especially, what's happening in your own house. Informants had come to him months ago, told him about the secret meetings, about Pebekamen's careful recruitment, about Queen Tiye's growing boldness. They brought him evidence, offered to arrest the conspirators, to crush the plot before it could develop further. And Ramses said no. He said wait. He said, let it continue. He said, I want to see how far they'll go. I want to know who is truly loyal and who is merely pretending. His advisors were horrified, begged him to take action, warned him that he was playing with fire, that conspiracies have their own momentum, that once started, they're hard to stop. But Ramses was stubborn, convinced that in the end his wife would pull back, that her love for him would overcome her ambition for their son, that when the moment came, when she had to give the final order to actually murder him, her conscience would rebel, her heart would refuse, and the whole plot would collapse. He believed in her, you see, believed in the woman he'd married, believed that underneath the frustration and the scheming and the manipulation, there was still love, still loyalty, still some core of decency that wouldn't allow her to cross that final line. He was testing her, testing all of them, giving them every opportunity to turn back, to choose loyalty over betrayal, to prove that they were better than their worst impulses. And they failed the test, all of them, every single one, right up to the end, when they stood over him with blood on their hands. That's what he was trying to tell Hori in those final moments. That's what made the young conspirator go pale and start shaking his head in horror. "I knew," the Pharaoh whispered through blood-filled lips. "I always knew. I gave you chances to stop. I trusted you to be better than this. And you chose this anyway." Those were his last words. Not a curse, not a plea for help, but a statement of fact. An acknowledgement that his faith in human nature had been misplaced, that his belief in love and loyalty as forces stronger than ambition had been proved wrong. And Hori understood, in that terrible instant, understood what they had really done. Not just killed a pharaoh, but betrayed a man who had known about their betrayal and chosen to trust them anyway. Chosen to believe they would do the right thing in the end. That's why he wouldn't tell the others, couldn't tell them. Because the knowledge was too heavy, too awful, would break them the way it broke him. This is the tragedy at the heart of this story. Not that a conspiracy succeeded, not that a king was murdered, but that a man's faith in humanity was destroyed. That someone who believed in the power of trust was shown that his belief was naive, was childish, was ultimately fatal. Ramses III could have crushed the conspiracy at any point, could have arrested everyone involved, could have executed them, or exiled them, or locked them away where they could never hurt anyone. But he didn't, because he believed, truly believed, that given enough rope, people would use it to climb rather than hang themselves. That given enough time, conscience would assert itself. That love and loyalty were stronger than fear and ambition. And he was wrong, so terribly wrong. And that wrongness cost him his life. But here's the question that will haunt you, just as it haunted the conspirators. Was he wrong, really? Was his faith misplaced? Or was there something noble, something divine even, in his willingness to trust despite the danger, in his refusal to become paranoid and cruel, in his choice to believe the best of people, even when they were showing him their worst? Think about it. Really think about it. If you knew someone was planning to betray you, would you give them the chance to do it? Would you trust that they'd ultimately choose loyalty over betrayal? Would you rather die believing in humanity than live as a cynic who trusts no one? It's an impossible question. There's no right answer. But it's the question at the heart of human existence. The question that every relationship ultimately asks. Do we trust, or do we protect ourselves? Do we open our hearts, or do we build walls? Do we believe in people, or do we assume the worst? Ramses chose trust, chose openness, chose belief, and it killed him. But maybe, just maybe, that choice was more divine than any amount of self-protective paranoia could ever be. This is the secret history didn't want you to know. This is the truth that makes the story so much more complex than simple conspiracy and murder. This is why, 3,000 years later, we're still trying to understand what happened in that room. Why a god king let himself be killed. Why a man who could have prevented his own murder chose not to. The hours after the murder are chaos, exactly as the conspirators planned. But chaos is hard to control. Chaos has its own logic. Chaos reveals things that careful planning tries to hide. Queen T receives word from a breathless servant. The Pharaoh is dead. It is done. And for one moment, one brief, perfect moment, she feels triumph. Pure, unalloyed triumph. Her son will be Pharaoh. Her life's work has succeeded. Everything she sacrificed, every line she crossed, it was all worth it. But that moment doesn't last, can't last. Because already things are going wrong. Already the careful plan is unraveling. The fire in the eastern wing didn't do enough damage to keep the guards occupied as long as planned. They're already returning to their posts, already discovering Pebekamen's body alongside the Pharaoh's, already starting to ask questions about how palace servants ended up in the royal chambers at the same time as a fatal attack. The foreign assassin narrative is being prepared. Evidence is being planted. Stories are being coordinated. But it's not as smooth as it should be. There are too many inconsistencies, too many witnesses who saw things that don't quite fit the official story. And then there's Hori, the young conspirator who heard the Pharaoh's last words, who knows the terrible secret, who was walking through the palace like a ghost, unable to eat, unable to sleep, unable to shake the image of those blood-flecked lips moving, unable to unhear those final words. I knew. I always knew. He's going to break. Queen T can sense it. She can see it in his eyes when he's brought before her to give his report. She can hear it in the way his voice shakes when he describes what happened. He's a weakness, a crack in the foundation. And cracks spread. Cracks bring down buildings. Cracks must be sealed. She makes a decision quickly, coldly, the way she's learned to make decisions since this all began. Calls for a cup of wine, adds poison with her own hands, offers it to Hori with words of comfort and congratulation, tells him he's done well, tells him to drink and celebrate their success. And he drinks, because he's too far gone to resist, too broken to care, maybe even grateful for the escape the poison offers, and within hours, he's dead, taking the Pharaoh's last words with him into silence. But secrets are like seeds. Even when buried, they have a way of growing, of pushing up through the soil toward light. And this secret, the knowledge that Ramses knew and chose trust anyway, it won't stay buried forever. It's already infecting the conspiracy from within, already making the other conspirators question what they've done, already planting doubt where there should be certainty, already transforming triumph into something that feels more like damnation. This is how karma works, not as external punishment, but as internal dissolution, not as divine curse, but as human conscience asserting itself, not as justice from above, but as the natural consequence of betraying trust, of murdering love, of proving that the worst assumptions about humanity were right all along. And the truly terrible thing, the thing that none of them foresaw, is that this knowledge, this burden, will be worse than any earthly punishment, will eat at them for the rest of their lives, will make them wish they'd been caught and executed, because at least execution would be over, would have an end. Whereas this guilt, this awareness of what they destroyed when they killed the man who trusted them, this will never end. Will follow them into their graves and beyond. Do you understand now? Do you see why I had to tell you this secret? why the story is so much more than just another palace conspiracy. It's about the price of trust, about what happens when faith meets betrayal, about whether it's better to be the person who trusts and dies, or the person who kills and lives. It's about the fundamental question of human existence. Are we capable of being worthy of the trust others place in us? Or are we inevitably, unavoidably, tragically bound to disappoint those who believe in us? Ramses III bet his life that people would choose good over evil when the moment came, and he lost that bet. But the loss doesn't mean the bet wasn't worth making, doesn't mean faith in humanity is foolish, doesn't mean we should all become cynics who trust no one and nothing. His death teaches us something profound, that even when trust is betrayed, even when faith is misplaced, even when believing in people gets you killed, there's something noble in the believing, something divine in the trusting, something worth preserving, even at the cost of our lives. If your heart feels heavy right now, if you feel like you need to pause and breathe and process what you've just learned, comment the word calm and let me know you're still with me. Because we're only halfway through this journey, and it gets harder from here. The consequences are still unfolding, the karma is still working itself out, and before we reach the end, you'll see how a conspiracy born from love destroys everyone it touches, how a murder committed in the name of a son ends up destroying that son most of all, how the worst betrayal is not the one that comes from enemies, but the one that comes from those who claim to love us. The Pharaoh's blood is still wet on the floor, the palace is still in chaos, and the real tragedy hasn't even begun yet. Chapter 6. The Prince's Tears. 3 days after the murder, while the palace still buzzed with rumors and fear, and the official story of foreign assassins was being carefully constructed, Prince Pentaweret stood in the tomb where his father's body was being prepared for burial, and the world he thought he knew began to crack apart like sun-dried clay. You're standing beside him, watching his face as he approaches the embalming table, watching the precise moment when innocence dies and terrible knowledge takes its place. The tomb is cool, a welcome relief from the heat outside. Walls carved from living rock, decorated with prayers and spells meant to guide the dead through the underworld. Lit by torches that cast dancing shadows across surfaces that seemed to breathe in the flickering light. The smell here is overwhelming. Not just the sweet cloying scent of myrrh and frankincense used in embalming, but something underneath. The smell of death itself. Of flesh giving up its hold on life, of the boundary between this world and the next becoming thin and permeable. The embalmers are working by torchlight, old men who've performed these sacred rituals for decades, their hands steady and practiced as they perform the delicate work of preserving the Pharaoh's body for eternity. They've seen death in all its forms, natural death, violent death, death by disease, and death by age. But even they are disturbed by what they're seeing now, by the evidence written on the Pharaoh's body, in wounds and bruises, and the desperate marks of a man who fought for his life. Prince Pentaweret approaches slowly, each step feeling like it weighs 1,000 pounds, drawn forward by duty and love, but also by something else. Some instinct that what he's about to learn will change him forever. He's wearing simple white linen, the color of mourning. No jewelry, no royal insignia. Just a son coming to say goodbye to his father. A son who still believes the official story, who thinks his father died at the hands of cowardly foreign agents, who has no idea that the truth is so much worse. The chief embalmer, an ancient man named Uzaraman, who served under 3 pharaohs and has forgotten more about death than most men ever learn about life, looks up as the prince approaches. He doesn't bow, doesn't show the usual deference, just looks at Pentaweret with eyes that have seen too much, eyes that carry knowledge no one should have to carry. "My prince," he says, his voice like dry leaves scraping across stone. "I'm glad you came. There are things you need to see, things that the official reports won't tell you, things that perhaps you shouldn't know, but must know anyway." Pentaweret feels his stomach tighten, feels something cold spreading through his chest like ice water in his veins. "What things?" he asks, his voice coming out smaller than he intended, more like a boy's voice than a prince's. The embalmer doesn't answer with words, just gestures to the body, to the wounds that cover it, to the story written in flesh and blood that can't be hidden or explained away. "Come closer. Look at these wounds. Really look at them," Uzaraman says, and Pentaweret does, forcing himself to step up to the table, to look down at his father's body, at the man who raised him, taught him, loved him, now reduced to this, to meat and bone waiting to be preserved. The wounds are terrible. Multiple stab wounds from different angles, defensive cuts on the hands and forearms where Ramses tried to protect himself, bruising around the throat that matches the grip of someone the pharaoh grappled with in his final moments. But it's the pattern that tells the real story, Uzaraman explains, running his finger in the air above the wounds without touching them. These are not the wounds of foreign assassins striking quickly in darkness. These are the marks of a prolonged struggle, of multiple attackers coming from different directions, of a man fighting for his life against people who were close enough to surround him. Foreign agents would have struck and fled. But this speaks of people who had access, who knew when the pharaoh would be alone, who could get close without triggering immediate alarm. Pentaweret feels the room spinning, feels his breath coming short and fast, feels sweat breaking out on his forehead despite the cool air. "You're saying," he begins, but can't finish the sentence, can't make his mouth form the words that his brain is starting to understand. "I'm saying this was not the work of foreign assassins," the embalmer says, quietly but firmly. "I'm saying your father was killed by people who knew him, people who served in this palace, people who had intimate knowledge of his routines and vulnerabilities." The old man pauses, lets that sink in, then continues. "And there's more, something even more disturbing. Look at the defensive wounds again. See how they're not just on his hands, but on his forearms, up near the elbows. See the pattern of them. This speaks of a man who had time to fight back, who wasn't taken by surprise in the way the official story suggests. This speaks of someone who knew the attack was coming and chose to meet it rather than call for help." The words hit Pentaweret like physical blows, each one making him stagger internally, even though his body remains still. "That can't be right," he whispers. "Why would father not call for help? Why would he face attackers alone when guards were just outside his door?" The embalmer shakes his head slowly. "I don't know, my prince. I only know what the body tells me. And the body says your father had warning, had time, had opportunity to save himself, and chose not to take it." For a long moment, silence fills the tomb, broken only by the crackle of torches and the soft sounds of other embalmers working in distant corners. Then Pentaweret hears footsteps behind him, turns to see his mother, Queen T,
entering the tomb with several attendants. She's wearing elaborate mourning clothes, face painted with ceremonial tears, playing the role of grieving widow to perfection. "My son," she says, her voice thick with manufactured emotion. "You shouldn't be here. The sight is too distressing. Come away and let the sacred workers do their duty." But Pentaweret doesn't move, doesn't take his eyes off his mother. And for the first time in his life, he looks at her not with love or respect, but with suspicion, with dawning horror, with the terrible questions that are forming in his mind like poison flowers blooming in darkness.
"Mother," he says, and his voice is different now, harder, colder. "Tell me again about the foreign assassins. Tell me how they got into Father's chambers, how they knew exactly when to strike, how they disappeared so completely afterward." Queen T's eyes flicker, just for an instant, but it's enough. Pentaweret sees it, sees the moment of calculation, sees her deciding how to play this, what lies to tell, what story to maintain. "The foreign agents were clever," she says smoothly. "They'd been planning for months. They'd bribed palace guards. They studied Father's routines. They waited for the perfect moment during the festival when security was distracted." But even as she speaks, Pentaweret is remembering things, little things that didn't seem important at the time, but now take on new significance. He's remembering the day his mother took him aside 6 months ago, told him about a vision she'd had, a divine message suggesting he might be called to rule sooner than expected. He's remembering how many private meetings she'd had with Pebekamen and other palace officials, meetings she said were about managing the household, but which now seem sinister, conspiratorial. He's remembering the strange tension in the palace in recent weeks, the way certain people wouldn't meet his eyes, the way conversations would stop when he entered rooms. And most damning of all, he's remembering the way his mother has been positioning him since Father's death, telling him he must be ready to take the throne, that the gods have chosen him, that this tragedy happened for a reason. It all fits together now, all the pieces clicking into place like a lock engaging. And the picture they form is so horrible that for a moment Pentaweret thinks he might vomit right here in the sacred tomb. "Mother," he says again. And this time there's steel in his voice, an edge she's never heard before. The embalmers say Father's wounds suggest he was killed by people he knew, by palace insiders, by people who had access and opportunity. Her face remains calm, but her hands, those beautiful hands that used to comfort him as a child, clench slightly at her sides. The embalmers are mistaken, she says. They see patterns where none exist. They're old men whose eyes and judgment have been clouded by too many years staring at death. Pentaweret turns to Uzaraman, the chief embalmer, and asks directly, "Are you mistaken, old man? Has your judgment been clouded?" The ancient embalmer meets his gaze without flinching. "I have examined the bodies of kings for 50 years, my prince. I have seen death in all its forms, and I tell you with absolute certainty that your father was murdered by people from within this palace, by people he trusted, by people who knew him well enough to predict when he would be vulnerable." The words hang in the air like smoke from the torches, undeniable, unretractable, changing everything. Pentaweret looks back at his mother, really looks at her, and sees for the first time beneath the mask she's always worn, sees the calculation in her eyes, the fear of being discovered, the desperate grasping at control. "You know who killed him," he says. It's not a question, but a statement. A truth he can no longer deny. You know because you were involved. The silence that follows is absolute. Even the other embalmers have stopped their work, sensing they're witnessing something that will be talked about for generations. Queen T's face goes through a series of transformations. Shock, denial, calculation. Then finally a kind of defiant pride. Yes, she says quietly, her voice barely above a whisper but carrying clearly in the stone chamber. I know who killed your father. They killed him for you, my son. They killed him so Egypt could have the Pharaoh it truly deserves, rather than the weak successor who would have inherited the throne through accident of birth. The words are a confession and a justification rolled into one, and hearing them, actually hearing his mother admit to orchestrating his father's murder, breaks something fundamental inside Pentaweret. He staggers backward, his legs suddenly weak, his vision narrowing to a tunnel, the world becoming small and dark and airless. You had him murdered, he gasps. You killed my father so I could be Pharaoh. I saved Egypt, Queen T replies, her voice growing stronger now that the secret is out, growing more passionate. Your father was a great king, but he was growing old, making decisions that would have weakened the kingdom. You are young, strong, capable of leading Egypt to even greater glory. The gods themselves confirmed this through the vision you received. There was no vision, Pentaweret shouts, his voice echoing off the stone walls, bouncing back at them from all directions. You made it up. You murdered father and then convinced me I was chosen by the gods to replace him. You used me, manipulated me, turned me into... He can't finish, can't say the words, can't acknowledge that his mother has made him complicit in patricide, that his very existence as a potential heir was the motivation for the worst crime imaginable. The young prince's anguish is heartbreaking to witness. You can see his entire world collapsing. Everything he believed about himself, about his mother, about his place in the universe, all of it crumbling like sandcastles before the tide. Everything I did was for you, Queen T says, stepping toward him, reaching out. But he backs away from her touch, as if she's contaminated, as if her very presence poisons the air. For me? He spits the words like venom. You didn't do this for me. You did this for yourself, for your own ambition, for your own wounded pride at not being the great royal wife. You couldn't stand that your son wouldn't inherit naturally, so you decided to steal the throne with murder. And you convinced yourself it was love. Convinced yourself you were doing it for me when really you were just feeding your own ego, your own need to matter, to be important, to control the future. Each word is a blade, cutting through his mother's justifications, exposing the selfishness beneath the supposed selflessness. And you can see it landing, see her flinching with each accusation, see the truth of his words hitting home, even as she tries to maintain her righteous stance. I will not be Pharaoh, Pentaweret declares, his voice ringing with newfound resolve. I will not wear a crown purchased with my father's blood. I will not rule a kingdom built on lies and murder. I reject this throne. I reject this conspiracy. I reject everything you've done in my name. The words echo through the tomb, final and irrevocable, and Queen T's face goes pale as she realizes her son, the one person she did all this for, the entire reason for every crime and every risk, is rejecting not just the throne, but her. Rejecting her love, her sacrifice, her entire twisted logic. You don't understand, she whispers. You're in shock. You're not thinking clearly. When you've had time to process this, you'll see that I had no choice, that this was the only way. But Pentaweret is already walking away, leaving his mother standing in the tomb, leaving the body of his murdered father, leaving behind the life he thought he would have, walking out into the sunlight that suddenly feels too bright, too hot, too harsh for eyes that have just seen the darkest depths of human nature. You follow him as he walks through the palace, not seeing the servants who bow, not hearing the voices that call out to him, moving like a man underwater, like someone in a dream or a nightmare from which there's no waking. He ends up in the temple complex, in a small chapel dedicated to Ma'at, goddess of truth and justice. And there he finally breaks down, falling to his knees before her statue, tears streaming down his face, his body shaking with sobs that come from somewhere deeper than grief, from the place where identity lives, where we keep our understanding of who we are and what we're capable of. He prays, but not the formal prayers he was taught, not the ritual words from sacred texts, but raw, desperate pleas for guidance, for understanding, for some way to make sense of what his life has become. He asks Ma'at how to live with this knowledge, how to carry the weight of being the reason, however unwitting, for his father's murder, how to reconcile love for his mother with horror at what she's done, how to be a man of honor when honor seems to require punishing the person who gave him life. Sometimes the hardest thing in the world is not to act, but to know, to carry knowledge that destroys your peace, to see truth that shatters your illusions, to understand things you wish you could unknow. Pentaweret crossed that threshold today, went from innocent prince to bearer of terrible secrets, and he will never be the same. Can never go back to being the young man who trained with swords in the courtyard while his mother watched with pride, who believed in divine visions and rightful destiny, who thought love was always pure and mothers always knew best. That person is dead now, killed as surely as his father was killed. And in his place is someone harder, sadder, wiser. Someone who knows that the line between love and destruction is thinner than a dagger blade. Someone who understands that the worst betrayals come not from enemies, but from those who claim to love us most. And maybe that's the real tragedy here. Not that a king was murdered, but that a son's love was murdered too. That trust was violated so fundamentally that it can never be rebuilt. That the bond between mother and child was poisoned by ambition until it became toxic, became deadly, became the weapon that destroyed everything it touched. Can you feel his pain? Can you imagine discovering that everything you believed was a lie? That your entire potential future was built on your father's corpse? That the person you trusted most in the world is the person who committed the worst crime imaginable, and did it claiming to do it for you? If you can feel even a fraction of what Pentaweret is feeling right now, comment the word yes. Let me know your heart is still open, despite how dark this story has become. Because it's about to get darker still. The consequences are still unfolding. The justice is still coming. And before we're done, you'll see how karma works. Not through divine intervention, but through the natural consequences of our actions. How betrayal breeds more betrayal. How murder spawns more murder. How the conspiracy that began with love ends with everyone it touched destroyed beyond recognition. Chapter 7. The final thread breaks. The palace that had been holding its breath for 3 days finally exhaled, and what came out was chaos. Pure, uncontrolled chaos that no amount of careful planning could contain. You're moving through the corridors now, following multiple threads at once, watching as the conspiracy Queen T worked so hard to build begins to unravel, like cheap cloth. Each thread pulling loose and exposing more of the ugly truth beneath. It starts with Paherpajed, one of the guards who participated in the murder. A young man, barely 20, whose hands haven't stopped shaking since that night. Who hasn't slept. Because every time he closes his eyes, he sees the Pharaoh's face. Sees those accusing eyes. Hears those final words that Hori heard, but wouldn't repeat. Paherpajed is sitting in the guard's barracks, trying to act normal. Trying to laugh at his fellow soldiers' jokes. Trying to eat his morning bread. But his hand shakes so badly, he keeps dropping the bread. And finally, another guard, an older man named Kahotep, notices and asks if he's ill. "I'm fine," Paherpajed says. But his voice cracks on the word fine. Cracks. And breaks. And suddenly he's crying. Not quiet, dignified tears, but great racking sobs that shake his whole body. And the other guards are gathering around now, concerned, confused, asking what's wrong. And then it comes pouring out. He can't hold it anymore. The weight is too much. The guilt is crushing him. And he starts talking, starts confessing, starts telling them everything about the conspiracy, about the meetings in the forgotten storage room, about Queen T's promises, about the night they killed the Pharaoh, about the blood and the struggling, and the terrible moment when they realized what they'd actually done. The other guards listen in shocked silence. Some of them don't believe him at first, think he's having some kind of breakdown, gone mad from stress or grief. But his details are too specific, too accurate, too horrifying to be fantasy. And one of them, a loyal soldier who served directly under Ramses, runs to find General Herihor, runs to tell him that one of the conspirators is confessing, runs to set in motion the machinery of justice that's been waiting for exactly this moment. General Herihor is in the military quarters when the news reaches him. He's been waiting for something like this. He's had his suspicions about the official story from the beginning. Too many inconsistencies, too many convenient coincidences, too many people acting strangely. He's been quietly conducting his own investigation, talking to servants, examining the crime scene, collecting evidence that doesn't quite fit the foreign assassin narrative. And now here's the breakthrough he's been waiting for. A conspirator ready to talk, ready to tell the truth, ready to trade his testimony for whatever mercy might be available. Herihor moves quickly, takes Paherpajed into protective custody before Queen T's people can get to him, before the young guard can be silenced the way Hori was silenced, before the confession can be retracted or explained away. He brings the guard to a secure location, has scribes ready to record every word, and begins the questioning that will blow the conspiracy wide open. "Tell me everything," Herihor says, his voice not unkind, but absolutely firm, leaving no room for hesitation or half-truths. "Tell me who was involved, who planned it, who executed it, who knew about it. Everything." And Paherpajed does, the words tumbling out in a flood now that the dam has broken, names and dates and details pouring forth like water from a cracked vessel. He names Pebekamen, who's already dead, killed by the Pharaoh he tried to murder. He names Mesahure, who added the sedative to the wine. He names the other guards who participated in the actual killing. He names the women in the harem who helped by ensuring doors were unlocked and guards were distracted. And finally, reluctantly, with tears streaming down his face, he names Queen T, describes her role in planning everything, her promises of rewards and protection, her manipulation of their loyalty and their ambitions, her absolute certainty that what they were doing was right and necessary, and blessed by the gods themselves. As the confession is being recorded, as the evidence is being gathered, as the case against the conspirators is being built, Queen T is in her chambers, trying desperately to maintain control of a situation that's slipping through her fingers like water. She knows something has gone wrong, can feel it in the air, in the way servants avoid her eyes, in the unusual number of soldiers visible in the palace corridors, in the fact that Mesahure didn't show up for his regular report this morning. She's sent messages to her key people, but many aren't responding, and the ones who do respond are cryptic, nervous, clearly afraid of being monitored. She can sense the net tightening around her, but she's not ready to surrender, not ready to accept that her carefully constructed plan has failed, not ready to face the consequences of what she's done. She's still plotting, still planning, still believing that somehow she can talk her way out of this, that her position as royal wife gives her some protection, that the conspiracy is too big and involves too many important people for it all to come crashing down. But it is coming down, thread by thread, confession by confession, piece of evidence by piece of evidence. General Herihor has found the dagger that Pepikamen dropped in the royal chambers during the struggle, a distinctive weapon with the steward's personal seal on it, impossible to explain away. He's found the women who were supposed to unlock doors, and under pressure of interrogation they've admitted their roles, pointed to Queen T as the one who recruited them, who promised them advancement for their own sons if they helped. He's found the remains of the sedative in Mesahure's quarters, along with correspondence from Queen T written in her own hand, discussing plans in language that's coded but not coded well enough, obvious to anyone looking with suspicion rather than trust. The case is building, becoming overwhelming, becoming undeniable. And General Herihor knows that soon he'll have to make the move that will change Egyptian history. Soon he'll have to arrest a queen, charge her with regicide, bring her before justice in a way that's never been done before. Meanwhile, Prince Pentaweret, still reeling from his discovery in the tomb, is gone to see his half-brother, the legitimate heir, the son of the great royal wife, the young man who should have become Pharaoh if the natural order had been allowed to proceed. The two princes have never been particularly close, separated by the politics of the harem, by their mother's rivalry, by the unspoken competition for their father's attention and affection. But now Pentaweret comes as a supplicant, comes as a confessor, comes as someone who needs to set the record straight before it's too late. He finds his brother in the royal gardens, tells him everything, holds nothing back, explains the conspiracy, his mother's role, his own unwitting complicity, his complete rejection of any claim to the throne. The legitimate heir listens in shocked silence, watches his half-brother break down in tears, sees the genuine anguish, and realizes that Pentaweret is as much a victim of Queen T's ambition as their father was. Maybe more so, because he has to live with the knowledge of what was done in his name. "I never wanted this," Pentaweret says, his voice raw from crying. "I loved Father. I would never have agreed to this if I'd known. Mother told me it was the will of the gods, told me I'd had a divine vision, told me..." He can't finish, just shakes his head. The legitimate heir, a young man of perhaps 17 named Ramses after his father, reaches out and puts a hand on Pentaweret's shoulder. "I believe you," he says simply. "I can see this is destroying you. I can see you had no part in the planning. You're innocent of your mother's crime." But Pentaweret shakes his head violently. I'm not innocent, he says. My existence was the excuse for the murder. My potential claim to the throne was the motivation. Even though I didn't know, even though I didn't plan it. My ambition, the ambition Mother had for me, that's what killed Father. So how can I be innocent? It's a question that will haunt him for the rest of his life. The question of complicity without knowledge, of being the reason without being the cause, of having clean hands but a guilty heritage. The two brothers are still talking, still trying to make sense of the senseless, when General Herihor arrives with a contingent of soldiers. He bows to both princes, his face grave, his bearing that of a man about to do something he knows is necessary, but which brings him no joy. My princes, he says formally, I come bearing evidence of treason against the crown, evidence of conspiracy to commit regicide, evidence that implicates numerous members of the royal household, including, he pauses, looks directly at Pentaweret, your mother, Queen T. I know, Pentaweret says quietly. She confessed to me in the tomb, told me she did it for me, told me she had no choice, told me I should be grateful. The general nods slowly. Then I must ask you, my prince, what is your position in this matter? Are you standing with your mother or with justice? Pentaweret doesn't hesitate. With justice, he says firmly. Always with justice. Arrest her. Arrest them all. Let them face judgment for what they've done. I will testify against them if needed. I will help in any way I can to ensure truth prevails over lies. And so the arrests begin. Soldiers moving through the palace with a list of names, taking people into custody, separating conspirators from loyal servants, beginning the massive investigation that will take weeks to complete. Mesehure is found in his quarters, trying to flee through a window. He's captured and imprisoned. The guards who participated in the murder are rounded up. Some come quietly, resigned to their fate. Others resist and have to be subdued. The women from the harem who assisted are taken into custody, their chambers searched, their correspondence examined. And finally, the most difficult arrest of all. General Herihor goes to Queen T's chambers, walks through those elegant rooms where so much plotting took place, finds her standing on her balcony looking out at the Nile, standing in almost the exact spot where she stood months ago when she decided that her son's future was worth her husband's life. Queen T, he says, his voice carrying the weight of authority and sadness in equal measure. By order of the legitimate government of Egypt, in the name of justice for Pharaoh Ramses III, you are under arrest for treason, conspiracy, and the murder of the divine king. She doesn't turn around immediately, just stands there, looking at the river. And for a moment you see her as she really is. Not a monster, not a villain, just a woman who loved her son too much, who let that love twist into something dark and destructive, who made terrible choices believing they were necessary, who crossed lines that should never be crossed, and convinced herself she was doing something noble. When she finally turns to face General Herihor, her face is calm, almost serene, like someone who's been expecting this moment, who's had time to prepare herself for it. You forget yourself, General, she says quietly. I am a queen of Egypt, wife to the divine Pharaoh, mother to a prince chosen by the gods. You have no authority to arrest me. But Herihor is unmoved. You were a queen, he says. Now you're a murderer, and murderers have no claim to divine protection or royal immunity. The gods themselves demand justice for the crime you've committed against their earthly representative. The soldiers move forward to bind her hands, and she doesn't resist, doesn't fight. Just stands there with that strange calm as golden chains are placed on her wrists. Even arrested queens are accorded certain dignities. Even murderers who once wore crowns are not bound with common rope. As she's being led away, she passes by a window that looks out onto the training yard. The same training yard where she used to watch Pentaweret practice with his sword. Where this whole terrible story began, with a mother watching her son and feeling the pain of his unrecognized potential. Everything I did was for Egypt, she says to no one in particular. To everyone. To history itself. I saw the weakness in the succession, the threats to our kingdom's future, the need for strong leadership in dangerous times. History will vindicate my choices, even if you cannot. But General Herihor has heard enough justifications, has seen enough evidence of her guilt to know that her words are just smoke, just attempts to reframe murder as statecraft, betrayal as patriotism, selfishness as sacrifice. Perhaps, he says quietly as she's led past him, but history will also record that you chose murder over patience, treachery over loyalty, personal ambition over duty to the kingdom you claim to serve. Those are the choices that define a person's legacy, not the justifications they offer afterward. As Queen T is taken away in chains, as the other conspirators are locked in cells, as the evidence is compiled and the case is built, the palace transforms from a crime scene into a court of justice. Every room examined, every servant questioned, every piece of physical evidence catalogued and preserved. The investigators discover more than anyone expected, finding the storage room where the meetings took place, finding correspondence that reveals the conspiracy went back even further than suspected, finding evidence that Queen T had been planning this for years, not months, systematically building her network, carefully placing her pieces, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The scope of her treachery is breathtaking. She didn't just plot to kill the Pharaoh. She had plans for what would come after. Lists of people who would need to be eliminated or co-opted. Strategies for consolidating Pentaweret's power. Contingencies for every possible complication. It was a complete plan for a coup, for transforming the government of Egypt, for creating a new order with herself as the power behind the throne. You stand in that forgotten storage room where it all began, where Queen T first spoke her terrible plans out loud, where ordinary people agreed to do extraordinary evil. And you think about how conspiracies work, how they start small and grow, how they recruit through a combination of incentive and fear, how they convince people that the unthinkable is not just possible, but necessary. And you think about how they fall apart, too. Not usually through heroic intervention or brilliant detective work, but through the simple human inability to carry terrible secrets. Through conscience asserting itself. Through the weight of guilt becoming too heavy to bear. Through the natural entropy that affects all human organizations, but especially those built on lies and held together by fear. The conspiracy is over now, exposed to light, dismantled piece by piece. All its careful planning come to nothing. All its promised rewards revealed as illusions. All its noble justifications shown to be self-serving rationalizations. And the people who built it, who believed in it, who sacrificed their honor for it, now face the consequences. Now understand that karma is not divine punishment, but natural consequence. That what we sow, we reap. That betrayal breeds more betrayal, until everyone involved is destroyed. Sometimes justice doesn't come from the gods, doesn't arrive as miraculous intervention, doesn't manifest as curse or plague or dramatic vindication. Sometimes justice is just the natural result of actions playing out, of lies being unable to sustain themselves, of evil containing the seeds of its own destruction, of human conscience refusing to be permanently silenced. The conspiracy against Ramses III was doomed, not because the gods struck it down, but because it was built on a foundation of betrayal. And nothing built on betrayal can stand. Eventually, the weight of its own corruption crushes it. Eventually, the people involved in it are consumed by what they've done. Eventually, the truth emerges, not because truth is magically powerful, but because lies are inherently unstable, require constant energy to maintain, eventually exhaust those who tell them. And now the liars are in chains. The murderers await judgment. The conspiracy is exposed. And all that remains is the trial, the reckoning. The moment when society looks at what was done and decides what justice requires, what punishment fits the crime of killing a god. What can possibly be done to make right something so fundamentally wrong? If you're feeling the weight of justice closing in, if you can sense that we're approaching the climax of this terrible story, if your heart is both eager and afraid to hear what comes next, then you're exactly where you should be. Right on the edge between knowing and not knowing, between the crime and its punishment, between the action and its consequence. Stay with me. We're almost at the trial, almost at the moment when Queen T will have to answer for what she's done. Almost at the point where karma completes its work, and everyone touched by this conspiracy understands the true price of betrayal. Chapter 8. The Trial of History. The trial of Queen T and her conspirators became the most significant legal proceeding in Egyptian history, a moment when the very foundations of pharaonic authority were tested, when the sacred nature of kingship was challenged by the profane reality of murder, when a society had to decide what justice meant when a god had been killed by those who claimed to love him most. You're standing now in the Great Hall of Justice, a vast chamber in the palace complex that's been used for centuries to judge disputes and crimes. But never anything like this. Never a case where a queen stood accused of murdering her husband, where the stability of the entire kingdom hung on the outcome of legal proceedings. The hall is packed. Every noble family in Egypt has sent representatives. Foreign ambassadors crowd the galleries. Priests from every major temple are present to ensure religious law is properly observed. Scribes sit ready with their papyrus and ink to record every word for posterity, for history, for the future that will judge this moment as harshly as this moment judges the accused. The judges are the most senior legal scholars in Egypt, 7 old men who've spent their lives studying law and precedent, who understand that what they decide today will set standards for generations, who carry the weight of that responsibility in their stooped shoulders and grave expressions. They sit on an elevated platform at the front of the hall. Behind them, a massive painting of Ma'at spreading her wings, the goddess of truth and justice, watching over the proceedings with eyes that seem to see into every heart, every lie, every hidden motive. The accused are brought in, one by one. First, the minor conspirators, the guards and servants who participated in the murder or aided in its planning. They're in chains, but simple iron chains, not the golden ones reserved for royalty. They look terrified, as well they might, knowing that the penalty for regicide is death. And not a quick death, not a merciful death, but the kind of death that serves as warning to others, as deterrent to future conspirators, as statement about the absolute sanctity of the Pharaoh's person. But all eyes are on the entrance, waiting for the main event, waiting for Queen T. And when she finally appears, the entire hall goes silent. That special quality of silence that comes when hundreds of people stop breathing at the same instant. She's wearing golden chains, as befits her rank, but otherwise, she's dressed simply. White linen mourning clothes. No jewelry, no makeup. No elaborate wig. Her natural hair showing gray at the temples. Looking older than her years. Looking like what she is. A woman who's lost everything, gambling on a conspiracy that failed. But even stripped of her finery, even bound in chains, even facing judgment that everyone knows will end in her death, she carries herself with dignity, with the bearing of someone who once wielded power and hasn't quite forgotten how. She walks slowly to the defendant's platform, doesn't bow or show deference to the judges, just stands there, looking at them with eyes that reveal nothing, neither fear nor remorse nor defiance. Just a terrible emptiness, like someone who's already died inside and is just waiting for the body to catch up. The chief judge, an ancient man named Kamwaset, who served under Ramses II and has seen more history than most people can imagine, speaks first. His voice surprisingly strong for someone so old, carrying clearly through the vast hall. Queen T, he says, you stand accused of the most heinous crime known to our civilization, the murder of Pharaoh Ramses III, divine ruler of the two lands, beloved of the gods, protector of Ma'at, maintainer of cosmic order. You are accused of conspiracy, of corrupting loyal servants into traitors, of plotting for years to overthrow the natural succession, of placing personal ambition above duty to Egypt, above love for your husband, above the sacred laws that bind our society together. How do you answer these charges? Do you deny them, or do you confess? The hall holds its breath, everyone waiting to see what she'll say, whether she'll try to defend herself, or whether the evidence is so overwhelming that defense is impossible. Queen T is silent for a long moment, looking not at the judge, but at something beyond him, beyond the hall, beyond the present moment, looking at something only she can see. Then she speaks, and her voice is calm, almost conversational, as if discussing the weather rather than her own impending execution. I do not deny the charges, she says. I organized the conspiracy. I recruited the participants. I planned the murder of Pharaoh Ramses III. All of this is true, and I will not insult this court or myself by pretending otherwise. The hall erupts in murmurs, people shocked that she's confessing so readily, that she's not even trying to save herself. But then she continues, and the murmurs die down as everyone strains to hear. But I deny that what I did was a crime. I deny that I acted from base motives. I deny that I should be judged by ordinary standards of right and wrong. What I did for Egypt. I did because I saw our kingdom's future at risk. I saw the succession going to someone unworthy, while someone worthy was passed over. I saw the will of the gods being thwarted by accidents of birth. The judges exchange glances, some looking angry, some looking merely tired, all of them understanding that Queen T is about to give them a speech, is about to try to justify the unjustifiable, is about to claim that murder was patriotism. Ramses III was a great pharaoh in his time, she continues, her voice gaining strength. But his time was passing. He'd grown cautious, reluctant to take the bold actions our kingdom needed, hesitant where he should have been decisive, weak where he should have been strong. My son, Pentaweret, you all know him, you've all seen his capabilities, is everything a pharaoh should be: strong, intelligent, decisive, compassionate, blessed by the gods with natural leadership, destined for greatness. If only he'd been given the chance. I didn't murder a pharaoh, she says, her voice ringing now with conviction. I removed an obstacle to Egypt's destiny. I cleared the path for the leader we needed. I did what the gods would have done if they could act directly in the mortal world. I was their instrument, their tool, their hand reaching down to correct a mistake. The chief judge lets her finish, doesn't interrupt, even though her words are essentially claiming that she knows better than the gods themselves, that she has the right to decide who lives and who dies, that her judgment supersedes divine will and human law. When she finally stops speaking, he waits a moment to ensure she's done, then responds, and his voice carries disappointment more than anger, sadness more than outrage. Queen T, he says, your words condemn you more thoroughly than any evidence could. They reveal a heart so corrupted by pride that you can no longer distinguish between duty and ambition, between love and possession, between serving Egypt and serving yourself. You speak of your son's greatness as if that justifies your crime. But tell me, did you consult your son before murdering his father? Did you ask Pentaweret if he wanted the throne badly enough to have his father's blood on his hands? Did you give him any choice in this matter? Or did you simply assume that what you wanted was what he wanted? That your ambition was his ambition? The question strikes home. You can see it in the way Queen T's face falters, in the way her certainty cracks just slightly. Because this is the weak point in her defense, the place where her justifications fall apart. The fact that she never asked Pentaweret, never gave him a choice, never considered that maybe he didn't want the throne if it meant stepping over his father's corpse to get it. I knew what was best for him, she says, but her voice is weaker now, less sure. I'm his mother. I know him better than he knows himself. I knew that once he was Pharaoh, he would see that it was right, that he would understand why it was necessary, that he would thank me. But he doesn't thank you, the judge says quietly. He's rejected the throne, renounced any claim to succession, testified against you in this very court, told us that he loved his father and would never have agreed to this conspiracy if he'd known about it, told us that your love for him has become the heaviest burden he's ever carried. So tell me again how well you knew what was best for him. The hall is completely silent now, everyone watching Queen T's face, as the reality of what she's done finally penetrates her defenses. As she understands that she didn't just fail to make her son Pharaoh. She destroyed him, broke him, turned his life into a nightmare of guilt and shame and horror, all while claiming to love him, all while insisting she did it for him. You can see it happening. See the moment when her certainty collapses, when the edifice of justification she's built crumbles, when she's left standing in the ruins of her choices with no more excuses, no more rationalizations, just the bare, terrible truth that she murdered her husband for nothing, sacrificed everything for a goal her son didn't even want, turned love into poison and called it noble. She sways slightly, her face going pale, her hands gripping the edge of the defendant's platform to keep from falling. "I thought," she begins, but doesn't finish, can't finish, because what she thought doesn't matter. What she believed doesn't matter. What she intended doesn't matter. All that matters is what she did, and what the consequences were. The evidence is presented over the next 3 days, witness after witness taking the stand, telling their part of the story, how they were recruited, what they were promised, what they did, what they saw. Paherpajed testifies, still shaking, still unable to meet anyone's eyes, describing the murder in detail that makes people in the gallery weep and turn away. The women from the harem testify, explaining how Queen T convinced them that helping with the conspiracy would secure their sons' futures, how she played on their frustrations and fears, how she made it seem reasonable, even noble, to betray their pharaoh. The embalmers testify, showing drawings of the wounds, explaining what they mean, how they prove the murder was planned and executed by palace insiders, how the pharaoh fought desperately for his life, how he could have called for help, but chose not to. And then, most damaging of all, Prince Pentaweret testifies, tells the court about his mother's confession in the tomb, about her attempts to make him complicit after the fact, about her complete inability to understand that what she did was wrong rather than heroic. When Pentaweret speaks, Queen T finally breaks. You can see tears on her face, see her mouth forming his name, see her reaching toward him, even though she's in chains and he's across the hall. "My son," she calls out, "my beautiful boy. Please understand, everything I did was for you, all of it, every choice, every sacrifice. I just wanted you to have what you deserved. I just wanted you to be great." But Pentaweret doesn't look at her, can't look at her, keeps his eyes fixed on the judges as he speaks. "I never asked her to do this," he says, his voice tight with emotion. "I loved my father. I would have served him loyally all my life and been content. I didn't need to be Pharaoh, didn't want to be Pharaoh, not this way, not ever this way. What she did for herself, to satisfy her own need to matter, to control, to shape the future according to her will. She used my name, used my existence. But this was never about me. It was always about her." The words hang in the air like a verdict, more final than anything the judges will pronounce, because they come from the one person whose opinion Queen T cares about, the one person she did all this for. And they tell her that not only did she fail, but that she was wrong from the beginning. Wrong in her assumptions, wrong in her understanding, wrong in everything she believed about her son and what he needed. The judges deliberate for 3 days, though everyone knows what the verdict will be. The evidence is overwhelming, the confession is clear, there's no doubt about guilt, only questions about punishment, about what justice requires in a case like this, about what message needs to be sent to future generations about the sanctity of the pharaoh's life. When they return with their verdict, the hall is even more packed than before. People standing in the corridors, pressing against the walls, everyone wanting to witness this moment, wanting to be able to say they were there when history was made. The chief judge stands, unrolls a scroll, begins to read in that same strong voice that seems to come from somewhere deeper than his frail body. "We find the defendant Queen T guilty on all charges. Guilty of conspiracy, guilty of murder, guilty of treason against the crown, guilty of violating every sacred law that holds our civilization together. We find the other defendants similarly guilty in varying degrees, according to their participation, Some guilty of murder, some of conspiracy, some of aiding and abetting, but all guilty, all deserving of punishment. The sentences are pronounced one by one. Death for those who actually struck the Pharaoh. Death for those who planned and organized the conspiracy. Exile for those who played supporting roles. Stripped of property and forbidden from ever returning to Egypt. And for Queen T, the most severe sentence. Not just death, but a specific kind of death. Not the relatively merciful poison usually given to royal prisoners, but execution by fire. The traditional punishment for those who commit crimes against the gods themselves. For those whose actions are so heinous that even death isn't enough. Whose very existence must be erased as thoroughly as possible. The sentence reflects not just the severity of her crime, but the court's determination to send a message about the consequences of regicide, about the absolute protection the law affords to pharaohs, about the fact that no motive, however seemingly noble, justifies murdering the divine king. When the sentence is read, Queen T shows no reaction, doesn't plead or cry or protest, just stands there with that same terrible emptiness in her eyes, like someone who's already left her body, who's already moved beyond caring about physical punishment, because the real punishment, the rejection by her son, has already destroyed her from the inside. She's led away in chains, back to the cells where she'll wait for her execution. And as she passes the place where Pentaweret is sitting, she stops, looks at him one final time. "I'm sorry," she says, so quietly that most people don't hear it. But you do, standing next to her, invisible, witnessing everything. "I'm sorry I failed you. I'm sorry I wasn't the mother you deserved. I'm sorry my love became poison." But Pentaweret still doesn't look at her, can't look at her, just stares straight ahead while tears stream down his face, and she's led away, led out of the hall, led toward her death. The trial is over, but the repercussions will last for generations, will change how Egypt thinks about royal succession, about the limits of maternal love, about the danger of ambition unchecked by wisdom, about the price of believing that ends justify means. The conspiracy of Queen T will be studied in temple schools, used as a cautionary tale, held up as example of how even intelligent, capable people can lose their way when pride and ambition cloud their judgment, when love becomes possessive rather than liberating, when the desire to control the future overwhelms respect for the present. And somewhere in all of this, in all the testimony and evidence and legal proceedings, is a lesson about human nature, about how we're all capable of terrible things if we convince ourselves our motives are pure, about how the worst evil often comes dressed in the language of love and duty, about how we must be constantly vigilant against our own capacity for self-deception, for believing we're doing good when we're actually doing harm. The defendants are taken back to their cells, the hall slowly empties, the scribes finish their recording, and you're left standing in that vast space thinking about justice, about whether it was served here, about whether any punishment can really balance the scales when a god-king has been murdered, when a son has been destroyed by his mother's ambition, when so many lives have been ruined by one woman's inability to accept that she couldn't control her son's destiny. Is justice revenge or restoration? Punishment or prevention? About making things right, or simply ensuring they don't get worse? These are questions without easy answers. questions that every society must grapple with, questions that this trial has raised but cannot fully resolve. What's clear is that Queen T will die. The other conspirators will die or be exiled, and Egypt will try to move forward, try to heal, try to rebuild the trust that was shattered when those closest to power proved to be the most dangerous people in the kingdom. Sometimes trials don't provide closure, don't heal wounds, don't make everything okay again. They just mark the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. They record for history what happened and what the response was. They set precedents and establish boundaries, but they can't undo what was done, can't bring back the dead, can't restore innocence to those who've seen too much. The trial of Queen T accomplished what it needed to accomplish, established that even queens are subject to law, that even those who claim to act from love can be judged for their actions, that murder is murder, regardless of motive. But it couldn't give Prince Pentaweret back his father, couldn't give him back his innocence, couldn't erase the knowledge that his existence was the excuse for the worst crime in Egyptian history. Justice was done, but no one feels victorious. Everyone just feels tired, sad, diminished by what they've witnessed, by what they've learned about human nature's dark side, by what they understand now about how easily good intentions can lead to evil actions. If you're feeling the weight of judgment, if you're thinking about your own capacity for self-deception, if you're wondering whether you're capable of convincing yourself that wrong is right when it serves your purposes, then this trial has done what it was meant to do, has made you think, made you question, made you examine your own heart and motives. Because that's what the best trials do. Not just punish the guilty, but educate the innocent. Not just impose sentences, but impart wisdom. Not just close cases, but open minds to the complexity of justice and the difficulty of judging others while knowing how flawed we are ourselves. The trial is over. The verdicts are in. The sentences will be carried out. And all that remains is to see what happens next. To follow Prince Pentaweret into his exile. To witness the final chapter of this tragedy. To understand what becomes of those who survive when everything they believed has been destroyed. Chapter 9: The Oasis of Exile. 6 months after the trial, after the executions have been carried out and the conspirators have been dealt with according to their crimes, after Egypt has tried to return to normal and the new Pharaoh has been crowned, and the palace has been purified with sacred rituals meant to cleanse it of the taint of murder, you find yourself in a place as far from the golden splendor of Thebes as it's possible to be, while still remaining in Egypt. A small oasis in the western desert called Siwa, where the sand stretches endlessly in all directions, where water bubbles up from underground springs to create a tiny paradise in the midst of desolation, where people, exiled from civilization, come to live out their days, forgotten by the world they once knew. This is where Prince Pentaweret lives now. Not in a palace, but in a simple mud brick house, not served by dozens of attendants, but caring for himself. Not training to be Pharaoh, but tending date palms and teaching the local children to read and write. Living a life so completely different from the one he was born to, that sometimes he wakes up thinking the past 3 years were a dream, a nightmare from which he's finally escaped. You watch him now in the early morning, before the heat becomes unbearable, as he walks through the palm grove checking on the trees, touching the bark gently, examining the dates to see which are ready for harvest, moving with the careful attention of someone who's learned to find meaning in small things, in simple tasks, in the quiet rhythms of agricultural life. He's changed physically, his skin darker from constant sun exposure, his body leaner from manual labor and simple food, his hands calloused from work instead of weapons, his hair longer and unadorned, tied back with a simple cord instead of the elaborate styles he wore as a prince. But the biggest changes are internal, in his eyes, which carry a depth of sorrow that wasn't there before, in his manner, which is gentle and humble, where once it was confident and proud, in the way he moves through the world like someone who's learned that he's not the center of it, that his desires don't matter as much as he once thought, that there's a strange freedom in having nothing left to lose. He lives alone. The people of Siwa know who he is, but they don't treat him like a prince. They treat him like what he is, an exile, a man who's paid a terrible price for crimes he didn't commit, someone who carries his mother's sins like a physical burden, even though he's innocent of them. They're kind to him, these desert people. They bring him food sometimes, invite him to their gatherings, include him in their community. But there's always a distance, always an awareness that he's not truly one of them, that he comes from a world they can't understand, that he's running from something they can't imagine. And Pentaweret doesn't try to bridge that distance, doesn't try to explain, doesn't try to make them understand. He just accepts their kindness with quiet gratitude and keeps to himself mostly, finding solace in solitude, in silence, in the vast empty spaces of the desert that somehow feel less lonely than the crowded palace where he grew up. He writes letters sometimes, letters to General Herihor in Thebes, letters that are carried by traders who pass through Siwa on their way to Libya or the Mediterranean coast. Letters in which he asks about Egypt, about the new Pharaoh, about whether the kingdom has healed from the wound his mother inflicted. And Herihor writes back, not every time, but often enough, telling him that Egypt is recovering, that the new Pharaoh is doing well, that the conspiracy is becoming history rather than current event, that time is doing what time always does, moving forward, healing wounds, making yesterday's crisis into today's cautionary tale. But Herihor's letters also tell him something else, something that Pentaweret both needs to hear and dreads hearing, that he's not forgotten, that people in Thebes still talk about him, that there are those who believe he should be allowed to return, that his exile was unfair since he was innocent of the conspiracy, that he's suffered enough for his mother's crimes. But Pentaweret has no desire to return, no wish to go back to that world of politics and intrigue and constant calculation, no interest in reclaiming his place in a society that will always see him as the son of a regicide, as the person for whom a pharaoh was murdered, as a living reminder of the worst betrayal in Egyptian history. Here in Siwa, he's just a man, a teacher, a farmer, someone whose past is known but not dwelt upon, whose present is simple but honest, whose future is undefined but free. He's learned something in exile that he never could have learned in the palace, learned that happiness doesn't come from power or status or recognition, doesn't come from being important or being loved by crowds, doesn't come from achieving greatness or leaving a legacy. It comes from something much simpler, from knowing yourself, from accepting what is, from finding peace with your own heart, even when the world sees you as tragic or pitiable or broken. There's a well in the center of Siwa, an ancient well that's been here since before anyone can remember, where the women come each morning to draw water, where the men gather in the evening to talk and smoke and watch the sunset, where the children play games that have been played for 1,000 years. Pentaweret often sits near this well in the late afternoon, watching the life of the Oasis unfold around him. And it's here that he does his deepest thinking, his hardest wrestling with the questions that still plague him despite the time that's passed. Was he responsible, even though he didn't know? Even though he never would have agreed if he'd been asked? Was his very existence the cause of his father's death? Does innocence of knowledge absolve innocence of impact? These are questions he'll probably never fully answer. Questions that philosophers and priests have debated for centuries. Questions about agency and responsibility. About sins of commission versus sins of omission. About whether we're accountable for things done in our name without our consent. One day, one of the local children, a girl of perhaps 8 named Tamutnefret, who's become particularly attached to Pentaweret, approaches him at the well with a question that cuts straight to the heart of his struggle. "Teacher," she says, her voice serious in the way only children can be serious, "my mother says you're sad because of something your mother did, something bad. But I don't understand. Why are you sad if she did it and not you? Why do you have to be punished for someone else's mistake?" The question hangs in the air, simple and unanswerable. And Pentaweret looks at this child and sees in her eyes an innocence he once had. A certainty about right and wrong that life hasn't yet complicated. And he doesn't have the heart to tell her that sometimes life doesn't make sense. That sometimes we suffer for things that aren't our fault. That sometimes the worst punishments are the ones we impose on ourselves. Instead, he says, "You're right, little one. I shouldn't be sad. I didn't do anything wrong." But love makes everything complicated. When someone you love does something terrible, part of you feels responsible, even though you're not. Part of you wishes you'd seen it coming. Wishes you'd stopped it. Wishes you'd been better, smarter, more aware. And that wishing turns into sadness. That sadness becomes part of who you are. The girl thinks about this, her face scrunched up in concentration. Then she says something that will stay with Pentaweret for the rest of his life. "My mother also says that sometimes the bravest thing is not fighting, but letting go. Not holding on, but releasing. Not trying to fix everything, but accepting what is. Maybe that's what you need to do, teacher. Maybe you need to let go of your mother's mistakes and just be yourself. Just be the person you are now, not the person you were or the person you might have been. Just this person, here, now, with us." The simplicity of it, the clarity of it, the wisdom that comes from a child who hasn't yet learned to make things complicated. It breaks something open in Pentaweret, something that's been locked tight since the day he learned the truth about his father's murder. And for the first time in 6 months, he cries. Not the bitter tears of guilt and shame he's shed in private, but tears of release, of relief, of beginning to understand that maybe he can forgive himself, even if he'll never forget. Maybe he can move forward, even though he can never go back. That night, sitting outside his simple house watching the stars that seem closer here in the desert than they ever did in the palace, Pentaweret writes a letter, different from all the others he's written to Herihor. Writes not about Egypt or politics or whether he should return, but about what he's learned, about what exile has taught him, about the unexpected peace he's found in losing everything he thought mattered. He writes, "I have learned that true nobility lies not in the accident of birth, but in the choice to serve something greater than oneself. My mother forgot this truth, and it destroyed her. I pray I will never make the same mistake. I have learned that power without wisdom is tyranny, that love without boundaries is destruction, that ambition without conscience is evil. I have learned that sometimes the greatest gift is being forced to start over, to build a new life from nothing, to discover who you are when all the props and supports are stripped away. I have learned that I am not what I own, or what I achieve, or what others think of me. I am what I choose in each moment, what I do with the circumstances I'm given, how I treat the people around me, whether I let bitterness consume me, or whether I choose something else, something harder but better, something like acceptance, like peace, like quiet, humble joy in simple things. The letter goes on for pages, ideas flowing from him like water from the well in the center of the oasis. And when he's done, when he's said everything he needs to say, he reads it over and realizes that he's not really writing to Herihor at all. He's writing to himself. He's writing to his mother, who's dead now, executed 6 months ago in a ceremony he didn't attend. Writing to his father, who's been dead for a year. Writing to the young man he used to be, who trained with swords and dreamed of glory. Writing to all the people he's been and will never be again. And then he does something surprising. Instead of sealing the letter and sending it with the next trader, he walks out into the desert, walks far enough that the oasis is just a smudge of green in the distance, and he buries the letter in the sand, covers it completely. Leaves it there as an offering to the desert, to the past, to the gods who may or may not be listening. A symbolic burial of everything that's been weighing him down, a release of the burden he's been carrying. A declaration that from this moment forward he chooses to live in the present rather than the past. To be defined by who he is becoming rather than who he was or who he might have been. When he returns to the oasis just before dawn, the sky already lightening in the east, he feels lighter himself. Feels like he's shed something heavy. Feels like maybe, just maybe, he's beginning to understand what forgiveness means. Not forgetting, or excusing, or pretending something didn't happen, but choosing not to let it define you. Choosing not to let someone else's mistakes become your prison. Choosing to be free, even when circumstances try to bind you. The people of Siwa notice the change in him over the following weeks. Notice that he smiles more readily, that he joins their gatherings more often, that he seems more present, more engaged, more alive. And they're happy for him. This strange exile who came to them broken and is slowly becoming whole. He'll never be the person he was before, can never reclaim that innocence, can never unknow what he knows about human nature's capacity for self-deception and cruelty. But maybe that's not such a bad thing. Maybe wisdom requires wounding. Maybe strength requires being broken first. Maybe peace requires passing through war. Years pass. Pentaweret becomes a fixture of the Oasis community. The children he teaches grow up and have children of their own whom he teaches in turn. The date palms he tends produce fruit that feeds the community. The simple house he lives in becomes home, in a way the palace never was, filled with books and simple furniture, and the quiet contentment of a life well lived, if not grandly lived. He hears news from Egypt occasionally, learns that the new Pharaoh is doing well, that the kingdom prospers, that the conspiracy of Queen T has become a distant memory, a story told to teach lessons about ambition and betrayal, that his half-brother who became Pharaoh sometimes speaks of him with respect and sadness, wishes he would return, but understands why he doesn't. And Pentaweret is content with this. content to be remembered but not involved, content to have made peace with his past by choosing a different future, content to have found nobility, not in crowns and thrones, but in small acts of kindness, in patient teaching, in honest work, in the quiet dignity of accepting what is, rather than mourning what might have been. There's a moment, several years into his exile, when a messenger arrives from Thebes with an official document, a pardon from the Pharaoh, a declaration that Prince Pentaweret is innocent of all crimes, that his exile was never legally mandated, that he's free to return to the palace, to reclaim his position, to take his place among the royal family again. The messenger reads the document aloud in the center of the oasis, in front of the well where everyone can hear. And they all turn to look at Pentaweret, waiting to see his reaction, wondering if he'll take this opportunity to return to the world of power and privilege he was born into. And Pentaweret listens carefully, thanks the messenger for bringing this news, then politely, firmly, graciously declines. "I am grateful for the Pharaoh's mercy," he says, "grateful to be officially declared innocent. But I have no desire to return. I have found something here in Siwa that I never had in the palace. I have found myself, found peace, found a way to live that doesn't require me to be anything more than what I am. And that," he says with a smile, "is worth more than all the crowns in Egypt." The messenger is shocked, tries to argue, tries to explain what an honor is being offered, what a privilege it would be to return. But Pentaweret is firm, kind, but absolutely certain. And eventually, the messenger gives up, returns to Thebes with word that the exiled prince prefers his exile, that he's found happiness in obscurity, that he chooses simple life over complex politics. And this news causes much discussion in the palace, some people thinking him mad, some thinking him wise, some thinking him cowardly. But those who knew him best, who saw what the conspiracy did to him, who understand the burden he carried, they understand perfectly. They know he's not running away, but running toward something, toward authenticity, toward peace, toward a life lived on his own terms, rather than terms imposed by birth or circumstance, or other people's expectations. And so Prince Pentaweret remains in Siwa, remains in exile by choice rather than by command, remains a teacher and farmer and friend to people who will never be important, who will never be remembered by history, who will never do anything that scribes will record or artists will paint, but who live their lives with honesty and kindness and quiet courage. And Pentaweret comes to believe that this simple, unrecorded life is more valuable than all the grandeur and glory he once thought he wanted. Sometimes at night, sitting outside his house, looking up at the same stars his father looked at, the same stars his mother looked at when she was plotting her terrible conspiracy, Pentaweret wonders what lesson is supposed to be drawn from his story, what future generations will learn from the tale of Queen T's ambition and its consequences. And he hopes, he truly hopes, that the lesson isn't just about the danger of ambition or the price of betrayal, but about something more subtle, more profound, about the possibility of redemption, about the chance for new beginnings, about the truth that we are not defined by our worst moments or our family's worst moments, that we can choose who we become, that even in exile, even in loss, even in carrying the weight of terrible knowledge, we can find beauty. can find purpose, can find peace. That's the lesson he wants people to take from his story. Not that tragedy is inevitable, but that healing is possible. Not that we're trapped by our past, but that we can create our future. Not that exile is punishment, but that sometimes it's liberation. Sometimes being cast out of the world we knew is exactly what we need to discover who we really are. If you're still with me, if you followed this journey all the way from the Golden Palace to the desert oasis, if you've witnessed the full arc from conspiracy to consequence to redemption, then you understand now that this story was never just about murder and betrayal. It was about the human capacity for self-deception and self-discovery. About how we can convince ourselves that wrong is right, and then have to live with the consequences. About how the worst crimes are often committed in the name of love. About how the hardest journey is the one from who we think we should be to who we actually are. Pentaweret found that journey in exile, found it in loss, found it in being stripped of everything he thought defined him. And what he discovered was that beneath the prince, beneath the sun, beneath all the roles and identities he'd worn, there was just a human being, flawed and broken and trying his best. And that human being was enough, was more than enough, was exactly what he needed to be. Conclusion: the great reward. 3,000 years have passed since the night Queen T's conspiracy culminated in murder. 3,000 years since Ramses III died in his own chambers, killed by people he trusted. 3,000 years since Prince Pentaweret learned the terrible truth and chose exile over a stolen crown. And now you're here, in this moment, listening to their story, carrying their lessons forward into your own time, your own life, your own struggles with love and ambition, and the eternal question of how to be good when being good is hard. Let me tell you now what history doesn't always make clear. Let me reveal the final secret that ties this whole story together, the ultimate lesson that makes sense of all the pain and betrayal and loss, the great reward that I promised you at the beginning of this journey. The secret is this: Ramses III knew he was going to die, not just in those final moments when the conspirators burst into his room, not just in the weeks before when his informants warned him about the plot, but for years, for most of his reign, he knew that someday someone would try to kill him. Because that's the price of absolute power, the curse of the throne, the burden every pharaoh carries, knowing that there will always be someone who wants what you have, who thinks they could do better, who believes their ambition justifies your death. And he could have lived in fear, could have become paranoid and cruel, could have seen enemies everywhere and trust no one, could have turned the palace into a prison and himself into a tyrant. But he chose something else, chose something harder, chose something that cost him his life, but saved his soul. He chose to trust anyway, to love anyway, to believe in humanity anyway, knowing full well that his belief might be his undoing. That's the great reward, not for Ramses, but for us, for anyone hearing this story, for everyone who wonders whether it's worth it to trust people who might betray you, to love people who might hurt you, to believe in humanity despite overwhelming evidence of human cruelty and selfishness. The reward is understanding that Ramses was right, that even though his trust cost him his life, it was still the right choice. It was still noble. It was still divine. Because the alternative, living in suspicion and fear, closing your heart to protect yourself, assuming the worst about everyone. That's not life. That's just slow death. That's letting fear win. That's giving up on the possibility that people can be better than their worst impulses. Ramses died believing in people who didn't deserve his belief. But in dying that way, trusting that way, loving that way, he proved something essential about what it means to be human, about what separates us from animals, about what makes life worth living, even when life is dangerous and people are unreliable and love is risky. Queen T's story teaches us the opposite lesson, but equally important. It shows us what happens when love becomes possession, when ambition overrides conscience, when we convince ourselves that we know better than everyone else, better than the gods, better than the person we claim to love, when we decide that our vision of the future is more important than other people's autonomy, their choices, their lives. She loved her son, genuinely loved him, would have died for him, killed for him, destroyed her entire life for him. But she never asked him what he wanted, never considered that maybe her ambition wasn't his ambition, never paused to think that maybe the greatest gift she could give him wasn't a crown, but freedom. Freedom to choose his own path, to make his own mistakes, to be his own person, rather than an extension of her will. And in failing to see this, in letting her love become controlling rather than liberating, she destroyed everything she touched. Her husband, her son, herself. Turned love into poison and called it noble. Sacrificed everything on the altar of an ambition that was never really about Egypt or destiny or the gods, but always, always about her need to matter, to control, to shape the world according to her vision. And Pentaweret, perhaps the most tragic figure in this entire tragedy, teaches us that innocence lost can become wisdom gained, that being broken can make us stronger in ways we never expected, that sometimes exile is liberation. Sometimes losing everything we thought we wanted reveals what we actually need. Sometimes the death of who we thought we'd be allows the birth of who we actually are. He could have spent his life in bitterness, could have blamed his mother, or fate, or the gods, or the accident of his birth for the loss of everything he should have had, could have let guilt and shame consume him, could have remained forever the broken prince, the victim of circumstance, the man whose potential was stolen by his mother's crime. But he chose something else, chose acceptance over bitterness, chose building a new life over mourning the old one, chose to be defined by his choices rather than by things that happened to him. And in making that choice, in finding peace in the desert, in discovering that nobility isn't about crowns, but about character, he achieved a kind of greatness that his mother's conspiracy could never have given him. The greatness of being fully himself, authentic, honest, free. Now, let me bring this forward to your life, to this moment, to the year 2025, because these lessons aren't ancient. They're not buried in the past. They're alive right now, in every relationship, every choice, every moment when we decide whether to trust or protect ourselves, whether to control or release, whether to let the past define us or create our own future. Right now, somewhere in the world, there's a parent trying to control their child's life, trying to force them onto a path the parent thinks is right, using love as justification for manipulation. calling possession protection. And they don't see, can't see, won't see that they're becoming Queen T, that their love is becoming toxic, that they're destroying what they claim to be saving. Right now, somewhere else, there's a leader who suspects betrayal, who knows that people around them are plotting, and they have to decide, do they act preemptively? Do they purge and punish and create an atmosphere of fear? Or do they do what Ramses did? Do they trust anyway? Do they believe in people's better nature, even knowing it might cost them everything? Right now, in this very moment, there's someone like Pentaweret, someone carrying the weight of their family's sins, feeling guilty for things they didn't do, unable to move forward because they're chained to the past, and they need to hear that it's possible to let go. Possible to forgive, not the crime, but yourself for being connected to it. Possible to build a new identity that isn't defined by what was done to you or what was done in your name, but by who you choose to be from this moment forward. These stories aren't fairy tales. They're not entertainment. They're mirrors. They're teachers. They're guides for how to navigate the impossible complexity of human relationships. How to love without controlling. How to trust without being naive. How to carry pain without letting it define you. How to be good in a world that doesn't always reward goodness. How to be wise without becoming cynical. How to protect yourself without closing your heart. The great reward I promised you isn't a happy ending, because there are no happy endings in real life. There are only moments of grace, moments of understanding, moments when we glimpse something true about the nature of existence and carry that truth forward into the unknown future. The reward is understanding that trust is still worth it, even though it's risky. That love is still worth it, even though it can be twisted into something terrible. That being vulnerable is still worth it, even though vulnerability can be exploited. Because the alternative, the life of constant suspicion and self-protection and emotional armor, that's not worth living. That's not actually life at all. That's just existence. Going through the motions. Keeping yourself safe, but also keeping yourself small. Protecting your heart by never really giving it to anyone. Surviving, but never truly living. Ramses III truly lived. He loved fully. He trusted completely. He ruled with an open heart. And yes, it killed him. But in the moment of his death, in those final seconds when he could have cursed his murderers or called for help or raged against the betrayal, he chose something else. He chose understanding. He chose to see his wife's crime as the tragedy it was. He chose compassion over vengeance. And that choice, that moment of grace, even in dying, that's what makes him more than just a pharaoh. That's what makes him divine. Queen T died too, died screaming in flames, her execution witnessed by thousands, meant as a warning, meant to show what happens when you betray the pharaoh, when you let ambition override every other consideration, when you play God and decide you have the right to take another person's life to serve your vision. But her real death happened long before the execution, happened in the tomb when her son rejected her, when the one person she did everything for told her that her love had become his burden, that her ambition had destroyed his life, that she didn't love him so much as she loved the idea of him, the potential of him, the version of him that existed only in her imagination. That's when she really died, when she understood that she'd sacrificed everything for nothing, that she'd committed the worst crime imaginable, and the person she did it for didn't want it, didn't ask for it, was broken by it. That rejection was the real execution. The flames were just formality, just the physical manifestation of an internal reality. She was already consumed, already burned, already reduced to ash by the truth of what she'd done. And Pentaweret died too, but differently. He died to who he was, and was reborn as who he needed to be. Died to the prince, and became the man. Died to ambition, and found contentment. Died to seeking external validation, and found internal peace. His death was the death of the false self, the constructed identity, the person he thought he should be. And in that death he found life, real life, authentic life. The kind of life that isn't always happy, but is always real. Isn't always comfortable, but is always true. Isn't always impressive, but is always meaningful. That's the real exile. Not geographic, but existential. Being exiled from the life you thought you'd have, from the person you thought you'd be, from the future you assumed was yours, and discovering that exile is actually freedom. That losing everything you thought you wanted opens space for discovering what you actually need. That the desert is where you find yourself, where you strip away everything that isn't essential and discover what remains. And what remains is enough, is more than enough, is everything you actually needed all along. So here's my final question for you. The question this entire story has been building toward. The question that every life eventually asks, whether we acknowledge it or not. What will you choose? Will you choose to trust, even though trust is risky? Will you choose to love, even though love can hurt? Will you choose to be vulnerable, even though vulnerability can be exploited? Will you choose to believe in people, even though people will disappoint you? Or will you choose safety? Will you choose protection? Will you choose to build walls around your heart and live in the fortress of self-sufficiency, never really connecting, never really giving, never really living because you're so busy surviving? There's no right answer. Or rather, there are two right answers, and they're both true simultaneously. Trust and be hurt, or protect yourself and be alone. Both paths have their wisdom. Both paths have their cost. You have to decide which cost you're willing to pay, which risk you're willing to take, which kind of person you're willing to be. I'll tell you what I believe. After spending 3,000 years with these people, after walking beside them through conspiracy and murder and exile and redemption, after witnessing the full arc of their choices and consequences, I believe Ramses was right. I believe trust is worth it. I believe love is worth it. I believe vulnerability is worth it. Not because it's safe. Not because it always works out. Not because people always deserve our faith in them. But because the alternative is to live in fear. And fear is no way to live. Fear is death pretending to be life. Fear is the slow suffocation of everything that makes us human, of connection and community, and the willingness to believe that despite all evidence to the contrary, people are capable of good. Love is real, trust is possible, and meaning can be found even in suffering, especially in suffering. Perhaps only in suffering. when we're stripped of our illusions and forced to confront reality without filters or defenses or comfortable lies. This story began in a golden palace and ended in a desert oasis. Began with ambition and ended with acceptance. Began with a mother's love and ended with a son's freedom. Began with murder and ended with understanding. That's the arc, that's the journey. That's what these 3,000 years have been teaching us, if we're willing to learn. That what we think we want isn't always what we need. That the worst crimes are committed in the name of love. That the greatest wisdom comes from the hardest losses. That exile can be homecoming. That death can be rebirth. That ending can be beginning. If we have the courage to let go of what was and embrace what is. If we have the strength to trust even after betrayal, to love even after loss, to believe even after disillusionment, to hope even when hope seems foolish, to choose life, real, messy, complicated, painful, beautiful life, over the safe, sterile, protected existence of someone who's so afraid of being hurt that they never really live at all. The Pharaoh's blood dried 3,000 years ago. The conspiracy was exposed and punished. The guilty paid their price. The innocent found their peace. But the lessons live on, carried forward by anyone willing to listen, willing to learn, willing to see in this ancient tragedy a mirror of modern life, a guide for contemporary choices, a reminder that the questions we face, the struggles we endure, the choices that define us, these aren't new. They're as old as civilization itself, as old as the first time a human being had to choose between trust and fear, between love and control, between being who others want them to be and discovering who they actually are. Thank you for taking this journey with me, for staying with me through the darkness, for having the courage to hear a story that doesn't have easy answers or comfortable lessons, for being willing to look at the shadow side of human nature, at what we're capable of when we convince ourselves our motives are pure, at how easily good intentions become paving stones on the road to hell. If this story has touched you, if you've seen yourself in any of these characters, if you've recognized your own struggles in their choices, if you understand now that you're not alone in facing the eternal questions of how to love without controlling, how to trust without being naive, how to forgive without forgetting, how to move forward while carrying the past, then the story has done its work, has planted seeds that will continue growing long after you've forgotten the specific details, will influence your choices in ways you might not even recognize, will make you just a little bit wiser, a little bit more compassionate, a little bit more willing to take the risks that real living requires. Sleep well if you've been listening to find sleep, and if you've been listening to find something else, some meaning or wisdom or connection to the vast sweep of human experience. I hope you found that too. I hope you'll carry these lessons forward. I hope you'll think of Ramses when you're deciding whether to trust. Think of Queen T when you feel tempted to control what you should release. Think of Pentaweret when you need to forgive yourself for things that weren't your fault. Think of all of them when you're making the choices that will define who you become. And may those choices be wise. May they be brave. May they be true. The night is ending now. Dawn is coming, and with it, the possibility of new beginnings, of fresh starts, of learning from the past without being imprisoned by it, of honoring the dead by living fully, by choosing trust over fear, by choosing love over safety, By choosing to be vulnerable and authentic and real, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. Because that's when it matters most. That's when we become who we're meant to be. Not in the easy moments, but in the difficult ones. Not when we're safe, but when we're scared. Not when we have all the answers, but when we're willing to live the questions. To embrace uncertainty. To trust that even if we don't know how the story ends, it's still worth telling. Still worth living. Still worth every risk we take. Every heart we open. Every moment we choose connection over protection. Life over mere survival. Love over fear. This is where forgotten voices have guided you through the ages. And now the journey ends, or perhaps begins, as every ending is also a beginning. Every conclusion a new question. Every answer the start of deeper inquiry. Go forth from this ancient story into your modern life, carrying what you've learned, being who you are, trusting when you can, forgiving when you must, living as fully as you dare. And remember, always remember, that the greatest tragedy isn't failure or loss or even death. The greatest tragedy is never really living, because you're so afraid of being hurt. Never really loving, because you're so afraid of loss. Never really trying, because you're so afraid of failure. Don't let fear win. Don't let Queen T's mistake become yours. Don't let the possibility of pain prevent the certainty of joy. Live. Truly live. And in living, honor all those who came before, who struggled and suffered and learned and taught, who passed their wisdom down through the ages, so that we, 3,000 years later, might be just a little bit better, just a little bit wiser, just a little bit more willing to take the risks that make us human. Goodbye, fellow traveler, fellow seeker, fellow human, trying to make sense of this beautiful, terrible, complicated existence. I'll be here if you want to return, want to hear more stories, want to explore more forgotten corners of history, where ancient wisdom waits to be discovered. But for now, rest. Sleep, if that's what you came for. Reflect, if that's what you need. And carry forward into your life the understanding that we're all connected, all struggling with the same eternal questions, all trying to be good in a world that doesn't always reward goodness, and all capable of being so much better than our worst moments. If we just have the courage to try, the humility to learn, the wisdom to forgive, and the faith to trust that despite everything, despite all evidence to the contrary, love is real, connection is possible, meaning exists, and we are not, any of us, ever truly alone.